A Stitch in Time by Amelia C. Adams. Copyright 2020 by Amelia C. Adams. Production copyright 2021 by Amelia C. Adams. Chapter 1, Topeka, Kansas, 1877. Jane Henderson, if your shipment of red thread hasn't come in yet, I'm afraid I'll have to throw a tizzy. Jane looked up from the box on the counter of her shop as Maud Thomas entered. It just arrived, Maud. I'm putting it away now. Maud's skirts rustled against the wooden planks of the floor as she approached. I don't know whatever put the idea in my head to sew a ruffled dress for Eliza's birthday, but here I am, and it's been the most complicated thing I've ever made. I think it was Eliza herself who put the idea in your head. Jane smiled, handing Maud 2 spools of thread, and you couldn't say no. You're right. I can't deny that child anything. But she's my first granddaughter, after what seems like 100 grandsons. She's bound to be a little spoiled. There are ways to fix that, you know, such as telling her no once in a while. But what's the fun of that? Maud pulled some coins out of her bag and handed them to Jane. Thank you. Now I can die a happy woman. Are you dying? Not any time soon, but when I do, I'll be happy. Maud turned and looked at the corner of the shop where the sewing circle met every week. Am I the only one here? You are, and for the first time ever, I think. I was motivated by my need of thread. Maud sat down in her favorite chair and pulled out yards upon yards of red fabric. I should have left most of this at home. I'm only doing the sleeves and bodice today, but for some reason I didn't think to get that organized. Jane smiled again. Maud never could seem to organize herself the way she wanted, which amused the other ladies of the circle to no end. Jane often thought that Maud should just accept herself as she was, instead of berating herself for what she wasn't. But apparently, things like that didn't happen in Maud's world. The door opened again to admit Thora Barton and Nola Johnson, who were deep in conversation about... Well, that couldn't be right. Did Jane just hear Nola say something about manure? I told him that was a terrible place to put it, but he didn't listen. He just laughed and gave me a hug. And believe me, you don't want a hug from someone who's been shoveling manure. Nola shook her head. I don't know what to do with that boy. He needs to get himself married and out from under my roof. But at the same time, he's been so helpful to me since Edward died. I can't ask him to leave, not after everything he's done. Did you say something about manure? Jane asked as Nola took her seat in the corner. Yes, I did. Nola shook her head again, clearly exasperated. Toby went out early this morning to get a load of manure from the farm down the road to fertilize my flower beds, and he piled it all right under my kitchen window. He says it's just there temporarily until he can get it spread around. But in the meantime, my kitchen has the most horrible smell. How am I supposed to cook in there with that stench? He's a good boy, Thora soothed. He's just trying to help you. I know that. But there are days, Nola sighed. God gave us grandchildren for a reason, did he not? Yes, he did, and mostly good reasons. Thora patted Nola's hand. Once the manure is spread out and dug under, you'll never even know it's there. And think of what it will do for your roses. Thank you, Thora. I'll stay focused on that. Jane's grandchildren had never piled manure outside her kitchen window, but they had done their own share of unusual things in their lives, and she smiled to think of them. She finished sorting through her thread shipment and came around the end of the counter to join her friends. This hour they spent together each week was precious to her, a chance for the widows in town to gather and share their challenges. It was hard for an ordinary person to understand what it was like to be alone, but other widows understood. She didn't even need to say much. They sensed what she was feeling because they all felt it too. "Where are the others?" she asked, glancing around at the vacant chairs. "I just saw Bonnie in Applebee's, so she should be here in a minute," Maud replied. She turned and glanced out the large pane glass window behind her. "Ah, and here come Viola and Esther now. Viola's hanging on to Esther's arm. Her arthritis must be acting up today." "That was too bad. Viola did suffer so." "And just why were you in Applebee's?" Jane asked, quirking an eyebrow. Maud held up a hand. "I promise you, Jane, I wasn't there to buy sewing goods. You have all my business in that regard. I was picking up a book Mrs. Haight ordered. Her mother's poorly today, so she couldn't come in herself. You know I'm your faithful customer." Jane narrowed her eyes. "I should hope so," she said. Her friends knew they were free to shop wherever they liked, and her threats were in jest. But when she opened this shop the previous year, they'd sworn their loyalty to her, and it had become somewhat of a ritual to tease them about it. The door opened again, this time swinging backwards a bit faster than Jane liked, and she flinched, relieved when it didn't hit the wall behind it. "I've just gotten a letter from Miriam," Esther said, waving a sheet of paper in the air. "Well, sit down and tell us about it," Thora urged. Miriam had grown up in their neighborhood, and they all considered her their granddaughter, too. Esther took a seat, and the others crowded around. Bonnie entered just in time to join them. "Dear Grandma," Esther looked up, her eyes shining. "She says that she's missed Topeka so much. She's decided to come home." The ladies each gasped or exclaimed. This was good news indeed. "Does she say when she'll be here?" Maud asked. Esther was reading as fast as she could. "Here it is. She's taking the train on Monday morning. She's not sure how long the journey will last, but she's sure Mr. Hoover can give us her exact arrival time, being the station master and all. Of course, it took a few days for the letter to get here, so she's on the train now, most likely. Oh, this is so exciting!" "Where is she coming from this time?" Thora asked. "New York City." "I thought she was in San Francisco," Bonnie said. "That was before New York." Esther laid the paper on her lap, her eyes shining. "I can't believe it. She's finally coming home. Now if she'll only stay." "She certainly travels more than I did when I was a girl," Maud said. "In my day, you were lucky to get a wedding trip, and that was the extent of it." "Well, things were different when we were young," Jane reminded her. "Today's girls are so independent and forward-thinking. They're becoming doctors now, for goodness sake." Maud looked appalled. "I don't think I'd trust myself to be seen by a female doctor," she replied. "There's so much that could go wrong." "Let's not get distracted from Esther's letter," Thora said, sharing in her good news. "I'm sorry, Esther." Jane nodded at her. "Please tell us more." "She says she'll stay at least through the end of summer, while she decides where to go next. And she's looking forward to seeing me." Esther gave a happy sigh. "My girl, all the way until the end of summer. Oh, I wish her parents were still alive. They'd be so proud of her." "Yes, they would be." Nola put her hand on Esther's shoulders. "She's a wonderful girl." "Is it selfish of me to want her to stay longer? Summer will be here before we know it, and then she'll be gone again." "What she needs is a good incentive to stay," Maud replied. "Maybe if she got a job she enjoyed. Is the Brody Hotel hiring?" "They're always hiring," Jane answered. "Oh, she wouldn't give up her travels for a waitressing job," Esther said. "It would have to be something much larger than that." "Perhaps if you had an illness?" Bonnie suggested. "She wouldn't leave you if you were sick." "I'm as fit as a fiddle." "You could pretend." Bonnie looked hopeful. "Dr. Waymont would spot the lie in an instant. No, we need something more." Esther shook her head. just don't know. She's always been so free-spirited. I never knew what would catch her interest." "A man," Viola proclaimed from the corner, her gray curls quivering. "She needs a man." "That's a wonderful idea." Maud turned back to Esther. "Do you think she'd stay if she fell in love?" "She might, or she might take him with her," Esther replied. "I wonder what sort of man it would take to keep her here. He'd have to be dashing, of course. She'd never settle for someone uninteresting." "I always thought she and Toby might make a match," Nola said. "They got along well enough in school." "I'd wondered about that myself, but then her pride got in the way, and she refused to speak with him after they graduated." Esther shook her head. "I don't even remember what she was so angry about. But Toby did something to offend her, and she never got over it." "He didn't mention anything to me," Nola said. "I'm sorry on his behalf for whatever it was." Esther waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. "I'm sure it was nothing. Miriam has a way of carrying grudges long past their time, and they're often rooted in something completely inconsequential." "Whatever it was, it would be nice if they could patch things up," Jane said. She glanced around at the thread and the fabric and yarn that surrounded them and chuckled. "We certainly know a thing or two about patching things up here, don't we?" "Yes, we do," Thora said. "Not only do we sew, but we've got hundreds of years of experience between the lot of us, and we can share that experience with them." She paused at everyone's aghast faces. "Oh, come now, ladies. Haven't you ever thought to do the math? There are 7 of us, not one younger than 60. That's at least 420 years of wisdom sitting right here in this room. We should know a thing or two about forgiveness after all that living." 420? Bonnie looked a little pale. "My goodness, how did we get so old?" "Oh, day after day, waking up every morning," Jane said cheerfully. "Age isn't anything to fear. I'd be more afraid to live without really living. I want to have plenty of adventures before I die. If Miriam does leave again, maybe I'll go with her. See the world." "But who would run your shop?" Thora asked. "I don't think she's serious," Nola explained. "Who knows? Maybe I am," Jane grinned. "I can see myself standing on Egyptian sands, staring up at the pyramids, or walking along the Great Wall of China." "I think she's lost her mind," Bonnie said, attempting to whisper, but failing. "She needs a distraction," Nola replied. "I most likely do need a distraction, and I know just the thing," Jane said. "Ladies, I have a proposition. Toby needs something better to do than making Nola's kitchen smell like manure. And Miriam needs a reason to stay in Topeka. I say we find out why they stopped speaking to each other and help them reconnect." "Are you saying that we should be their matchmakers?" Bonnie asked. Jane gave a decided nod. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. If they're still angry with each other after all this time, it's obvious they need a little help when it comes to sorting out their feelings. And with our advanced age comes the wisdom they need. If nothing romantic develops, perhaps they'll at least apologize and become friends again. What do you say?" One by one, the women nodded. "I don't know how to be a matchmaker, though," Bonnie said. "I'm not sure that any of us actually knows. We'll figure it out as we go," Jane assured her. "I think the first order of business is to find out exactly when Miriam's train is arriving." "I'll talk to Mr. Hoover this afternoon," Esther promised. "Should I tell Toby that she's coming? Or should we let it be a surprise?" Nola asked. Jane considered that for a moment. "I think a surprise would be nice," she said at last, and the others nodded. "This is so exciting," Thora said, clasping her hands together. "I confess, I've been having a hard time this week, but suddenly I feel a bit better. Maybe I just needed something new to think about. With any luck, we'll be helping ourselves while we're helping them." Jane replied. This might not be the adventure she'd been craving, but it certainly was something out of the usual, and that was a treat. Chapter 2. Miriam Brown tried to settle into her seat and relax, but it seemed impossible. The train had just left the Kansas City train station, and the next large stop was Topeka, her destination. They'd stop here and there to take on more water, but for all intents and purposes, there was only one station remaining, and she would be home. Home. She sighed and rested her head against the window, gazing out at the fields they were passing. She'd struggled with that word, that concept, nearly her whole life. Her parents had been killed in a house fire when she was 6. She'd been raised by her grandparents, who took her in and loved her fiercely, but nothing truly felt like home without her mother and father. As soon as she could, she'd left Topeka in search of belonging, but she hadn't fit in anywhere. She'd gotten some higher education, taken a few jobs, all the while feeling as though she was pretending. She could make polite conversation, and she could discuss the news of the day as astutely as anyone around her. But at the core of it, she was a shell, a body, walking around without a soul. If there was one thing she should thank Gerald for, it was for showing her where she really was wanted, and now she felt silly for not seeing it all along. And that was enough about Gerald. She shoved him into the back of her mind again, determined to concentrate on her homecoming and making restitution to her grandmother. She knew she broke Esther Brown's heart every time she left, but leaving was the only way to fix the aching restlessness in her. When her grandfather passed away years before, she'd come home and stayed a few months to make sure Esther would be all right. But then she left again. She should have stayed. Any good granddaughter would have stayed. Even with all her regrets and realizations, she was still unsettled. Yes, she was going back to Topeka, but when she wrote her grandmother to tell her, she'd found it impossible to promise to stay. She'd meant to say it, but her pen just wouldn't create the words. She wanted to leave herself a back door, a way to escape again if necessary. And that didn't feel like she'd changed or learned anything at all. That was disappointing, considering how much she knew she needed to change. "Tickets? Tickets, please." The conductor, coming down the aisle, stopped at each row, giving the passengers a smile before moving on. It was the same thing on every train, and Miriam had been on plenty. She pulled out her ticket and had it ready when the man approached. "And where are you off to?" he asked. "Topeka," she replied. "You're almost there, then. Have you been traveling long?" "Since New York." He gave a whistle, and the ends of his mustache twitched. "That's a long time to spend cooped up on a train. You should treat yourself to some cherry pie at the Brody Hotel when you get off in Topeka. You deserve it." Miriam smiled. "Sounds like you have a favorite." "I do. I actually married the general manager of the hotel because I enjoyed the pie so much." He gave a wink, took her ticket, and continued down the aisle, greeting the passengers on the next row. Miriam smiled again as she turned back to the window. Marrying someone because of pie. That was such a delightful idea. It sounded so sweet and innocent. What would it be like to have a relationship based on such genuine fundamentals? She didn't know, and she wondered if she'd ever have the chance to find out. Such things didn't seem to exist anymore, and she didn't know how to make pie. Of course, it wasn't really about pie. It was about trust and integrity and honesty. All the things that should be present in a marriage. She'd seen it between her father and mother, even though she was young enough at the time they died, that she couldn't have named the traits she was seeing. Her grandparents had demonstrated that kind of devotion, too. Her grandfather brought home a small bundle of wildflowers every Friday, and her grandmother made his favorite cake for Monday night dessert. Those little rituals, those little acts that reflected their deeper feelings, they made Miriam sigh. That sort of romance, it appeared, was dead. She shook her head and glanced around the train, trying to find something else to think about. A couple of children were seated with their mother across the aisle, and she gave them a small wave. An older gentleman, traveling alone, was up ahead, his face buried in his newspaper. The height of the seats didn't allow her to see much more, and she felt alone, isolated. That wasn't at all helpful in distracting her from her discouraging thoughts. Just then, the little girl across the way popped up at her elbow. "My mamma says you look sad, and it's all right if I come to talk to you." Surprised, Miriam glanced over at the mamma, who smiled and nodded. "I'm glad you did," Miriam replied, turning her attention back to the little girl. "What's your name?" The child looked thoughtful. "That all depends on who you ask." Well, that was certainly an odd answer. "What does your mamma call you?" "She calls me May, but my grandma calls me Myrtle." "I see. And what would you like to be called?" The girl's face lit up. "Princess Amaryllis!" Miriam couldn't hide her smile. "Princess Amaryllis?" "Yes. Isn't that the most beautiful name in the world?" She clasped her hands under her chin. "It's definitely a beautiful name." Miriam looked over at the mamma again. The woman seemed a bit embarrassed. "Are you going visiting somewhere?" "No, we have to move because my daddy died and my grandma got sick. My mama got a job in Topeka where she can have kids." The girl leaned forward. "Do you know that at most jobs you can't have kids?" "That's too bad," Miriam replied. The girl spoke so straightforwardly. It was a bit unsettling. It was sad that such a young child should know so much about the hardships of the world. "Is that your brother sitting there with your mama?" "Yes, that's Freddie. And most of the time he's not a nice boy." Princess Amaryllis, Miriam, couldn't think of her as anything else now, shook her head with the air of one who knows everything. "My mama caught him trying a cigar out behind the woodshed. Cigars are stinky and they turn your teeth brown." "My goodness, I'm glad she caught him," Miriam replied. "Yes, he needed a stern talking to." She sounded like a tiny version of an adult. "Oh, I'm not being polite. I'm supposed to ask your name." "I'm Miriam Brown. I'm going to see my grandmother in Topeka." "Topeka is where we're going to live. My mother says it's not very different from Kansas City. That's where I was born. Do you think it's very different?" "I don't know, actually. I've only passed through Kansas City. I've never spent any time there." "Oh." This was apparently all the conversation Princess Amaryllis wanted to have. "It was nice to meet you. Goodbye." She returned to her seat, and Miriam smiled at her mother again. She imagined life was quite exciting with such a little chatterbox for a daughter, and a son so curious about doing grown-up things like smoking cigars. At last the train pulled into the Topeka station, and when it let out its last long hiss of steam, Miriam exhaled right along with it. The ride was over. She could set her feet on the ground and keep them there for a while. She'd probably dream about being on a train that night, but at least that would be in her imagination and not her reality. "Goodbye, Miriam Brown," Princess Amaryllis called out as she and her little family descended the train steps. Miriam waved, hoping they would settle in well and find happiness in their new home. She then returned to gathering up her bag and her parasol from her seat. She was dawdling because she knew her grandmother would be waiting for her on the platform. And as much as she wanted to see her, she also had no answer for the inevitable question of how long she was going to stay. She would like to formulate something in her mind to have ready, but nothing was coming up, and she couldn't delay forever. Finally, she walked down the aisle when the conductor greeted her with a smile. "Don't forget the cherry pie," he said. "Thank you for the recommendation. Safe travels." She grasped the rail and stepped down from the train, taking in a deep breath of the dry Topeka air she was so familiar with. "Miriam!" She looked up and saw her grandmother hurrying toward her, arms outstretched, and she opened her own arms to receive the hug. Warmth enveloped her from head to toe as she felt the unconditional love emanating from this woman, and she closed her eyes, feeling it trickle through her senses and seek out her broken bits to mend them again. "Oh, Miriam, I'm so glad to see you," Esther Brown said when she finally released Miriam from her embrace. "I've never been so excited in my life as I was to get your letter." "Not even on your wedding day?" Miriam teased. Esther looked thoughtful. "I'll need to ponder that a bit more. That was a long time ago. It's definitely a close tie." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "You look beautiful, my dear. Have you been well?" "Mostly," Miriam replied. "I had some chest congestion over the winter, but it didn't last long." "That's good. Have you taken your trunk off yet?" Esther looked over the growing mound of baggage being placed on the platform by the handlers. "I have 3, actually, and yes, they're right there." Esther raised an eyebrow. 3 trunks? That seems like rather a lot to bring on a visit, doesn't it? Miriam hesitated. "Well, it is, because it's everything I own. I've left my home in New York and won't be returning to it." "Oh, I see." Miriam braced herself for the inevitable slew of questions, but they didn't come. Instead, Esther moved over to the ticket window to speak to Mr. Hoover about arranging a cart for the luggage, and Miriam was stunned. Why wasn't she being peppered with questions? Why hadn't her grandmother pounced on that information like a cat on a mouse? Esther turned back with a large smile. "It's all arranged. Now, are you ready for some baked chicken and buttermilk biscuits?" "Oh, I'm always ready for your baked chicken, Grandma." "I thought so. Let's go then. Mr. Hoover's boy will follow along shortly with your things." Entering her old room was like opening a door and stepping into the past. Miriam walked around, touching the things on her dresser, noticing that everything had been kept the same. It had been dusted regularly, though. That was easy to tell, and the scent of lavender told her that fresh linens were on the bed. Esther had sent her upstairs by herself to get settled in, claiming she needed to get the biscuits in the oven. But Miriam recognized that she was being given the chance to sort through her feelings alone. Her grandmother had always known when she needed that time. She knew Miriam much better than Miriam knew herself. God had definitely blessed her by giving her such wonderful grandparents in the absence of her mother and father. That was what it all came down to in the end. Her mother and father were gone, and she'd never been able to understand why. Who really understood anything about life and death at 6 years old? Or at 23? When the fire was discovered, her father had carried her out of the house, set her under the jack pine tree in the front yard, and then gone back in to get her mother. Seconds later, the roof caved in. Miriam clearly remembered the sparks flying into the black night sky, the sound of the crashing wood, and then the voices of neighbors as they converged on the scene. They had been too late, every one of them, because the cabin was set back from the main road. This room was where she had been brought that night, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt and tucked against her grandfather's chest. This room held all her memories of loss and confusion, as well as her memories of being loved, and she didn't know how to let the good ones chase out the bad ones. It was all balled up in one room, just as her feelings were all balled up in one person. While she was here this time, she'd see what she could do about working through some of it. She was good at untangling balls of yarn. She'd done it for Esther dozens of times. She'd pretend her emotions were the same and start at the end, following the threads back until they made sense again. She heard a voice downstairs and stepped toward her door to listen. If it was someone she knew, she'd go down, but otherwise she'd stay upstairs and start unpacking. So she's here?
Did she have any trouble on the train?
An older female voice was asking. Miriam smiled.
She knew who that was. Thora Barton was one of her grandmother's dearest friends, and Miriam would love to see her. She glanced in the mirror to make sure her hair wasn't too badly mussed from taking off her hat, and then she trotted down the stairs. Two ladies stood in the entryway chatting with her grandmother instead of just one, and she heard the second one saying, "I tried to get him to come, but he was digging the manure under the front flower bed, and looked a sight.
We'll just have to arrange it another time."
"Who was digging manure?" Miriam asked, and all three ladies turned toward the stairs. "Oh, Miriam!" Thora came over and gave her a hug. "We're so glad you're home." "It's good to be here," Miriam said with a smile, then turned toward the second lady, Nola Johnson, another of her grandmother's friends. Her friend, too. They all were. This reunion was just a little less comfortable, not because of Nola herself, but because of Nola's infuriating grandson, who was yet another male person Miriam refused to think about. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson. I didn't mean to interrupt. What were you talking about? Manure or something?" Nola looked completely flummoxed, and Miriam had no idea why. She was the one with the reason to feel uncomfortable, not Nola. The older woman glanced at Esther as though looking for the right words. "She's having some help with her flower beds this year," Esther said brightly. "I'm sure they'll put ours to shame. I haven't fertilized properly in some time." "And I haven't even planted flowers," Thora chimed in. "I really need to put in some perennials. I did annuals for years, but that's when Victor was alive to help me." She gave a little sigh that was so slight it was almost unnoticeable. "Miriam, we won't stay long. We know you're about to eat your supper. We just wanted to come by and tell you how glad we are that you're here. But we do want to hold a welcome party for you," Nola said. She seemed a little more at ease now, for whatever reason. "We hope that tomorrow afternoon isn't too soon, but we thought if we waited any longer, everyone would have already seen you, and then what would be the point of a party? And we must have a party because parties are wonderful," Thora finished up. Miriam glanced at her grandmother with amusement. "Well, I have absolutely nothing on my calendar as of yet, so I imagine that tomorrow will be fine," she replied. "Oh, good. I'm so glad you said that, because everything's all arranged." Thora looked simply overjoyed at the prospect. "We're going to hold it here in the backyard, and we'll be here at 11 to start setting up. The party itself won't be until 1, but we need time to hang the bunting." "Bunting?" Miriam held up a hand. "Please tell me you haven't gone through a lot of trouble. A simple cake and punch is really enough, isn't it?" "Cake and punch and cookies and little sandwiches and pie," Thora replied. "But we're all helping. It's not just one person, so it's really not too much trouble at all." Miriam sighed. She wasn't going to be able to talk them out of their grandiose plans, so she might as well smile and go along with it. "Thank you," she said. "It means a lot to me to be welcomed home by my friends." "You still like chocolate, don't you?" Nola asked. "Does anyone ever stop liking chocolate?" Miriam gave a laugh. "Of course I do." "Well, I'm bringing some chocolate cake, and I hope you like it." Nola paused. "Other people who have tried it really liked it." The woman was acting strangely again, like there were things she wanted to say but couldn't actually say them. Miriam was going to ask her about it, but then decided against it. Whatever it was Nola's business and not hers. "I'm sure I'll like it too. You're such a good cook. Are you sure you can't stay? I'll bet Grandma made plenty. She always does." It seemed odd having a long conversation in the hall without inviting them to dinner, or at least to sit down. "Oh, no, dear, but thank you for the invitation. We'll see you tomorrow." Thora gave her a smile, and the two ladies bustled out the front door. As soon as the door closed, Miriam turned to Esther. "Did Nola seem a bit out of sorts to you?" Esther blinked. "Out of sorts? What do you mean?" "Well, it's hard to say, but she seemed uncomfortable, like she was keeping a secret." "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. Come along to the kitchen." "I had just pulled the biscuits out when they arrived. I hope everything's still hot." Everything was hot, and it was delicious. Her grandmother's churned butter melted into the biscuits in little golden puddles of sunshine, and Miriam couldn't remember the last time she'd had a meal that was so satisfying. But of course, that had everything to do with the magic of being home. Home. That word again. It wasn't confusing this time. Chapter 3. Toby dug the tip of his shovel into the dirt, lifted and flipped the load over, pushing the manure down a level, and making a nice fertile circle around one of his grandmother's prize rose bushes. She'd been a little irate when he'd first brought the manure home, but in truth he really could have stored it somewhere better. Even he had to admit that having a kitchen filled with such powerful odors was unfortunate. Today was the first chance he'd had to work on it since he'd brought it home, and he jumped at the opportunity. He hated to leave a task lying around undone, but he'd been needed for a rush job at the sawmill, and he had to go where the paying jobs led him. That's how it had to be if he ever wanted to build the little house he'd set his heart on. That's why he'd had to turn his grandmother down when she'd asked him to come along on her errands that afternoon. If he didn't take care of this now, he had no idea when he'd be able to do it. He knew he'd disappointed her, but he'd also disappointed her by making this mess, so he was in trouble no matter which way he looked at it. It was better to get it cleaned up than to delay it any longer. "Hey there, need a hand?" Toby looked up at the voice and saw Peter Thomas walking across the grass toward him, carrying a shovel of his own. Peter had been his friend since his school days. "I'll take all the help I can get," he called back. Peter chose a spot a few yards away from where Toby was working and dug in. "I'm glad for the chance to get out of the house," he said. "My grandmother finished Eliza's birthday dress and brought it over this afternoon, and there's been nothing but prancing around ever since. One should not give a little girl who was already so vain such an elaborate gift." Toby laughed. "You don't understand much about little girls, do you?" "No, not a lot. That's what comes of having mostly boys in the family." Peter shook his head. "So, that sort of thing's common, is it?" Toby moved a few feet down the row and started the next section. "All I know from growing up with my two sisters is this. If you give a little girl a new dress, she will twirl around in it. She has to see how big the skirt floofs out." "Floofs? Are you sure that's actually a word?" Toby shrugged. "I don't know what to call it. How about the total circumference of the fabric when subjected to aerodynamics and having been cut in a circular shape?" Peter chuckled. "I'll accept floofs, Mr. College graduate." "Thank you. And then, when the little girl happens upon another little girl, be she a friend or a sister, they must both twirl around to see whose dress floofs bigger. There's a hierarchical order to this practice, you see." "So, whoever has the floofiest dress wins?" "Exactly." Toby pulled a handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his forehead. "This bed is the last of it. Do you want to come in for some lemonade?" "I haven't worked long enough to deserve it, but sure, I'll have some." They leaned their shovels against the side of the house and wiped off their boots, then entered the kitchen. Toby found the lemonade and pulled 2 glasses from the shelf, then paused. "Oh, look, Grandma made a chocolate cake, too. Want some?" "Sure." Toby cut them each a generous slice, then they sat at the table. "So, what do you hear from Carol?" Toby asked. Peter started to choke on his bite and grabbed his lemonade to wash everything down. "You shouldn't ask me potentially dangerous questions while I'm eating." "Sorry, have you swallowed? Is now a better time?" Peter shook his head in exasperation. "I'd rather not talk about her at all. But I can see that you're not going to let me out of it." "You've guessed correctly. Now, out with it." Toby enjoyed seeing his friend uncomfortable. It was too bad that he'd also choked. That had been accidental. But after all the times Peter had teased him about one girl or another,
It was nice to turn the tables. Carol has decided not to accept my offer. Toby was about to tease Peter even further, but something made him pause. Peter seemed troubled, which was very unlike him. Maybe Toby should ease up a bit. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said instead. Turns out there was someone else waiting in the wings, and his pocketbook was considerably more attractive. Peter sat back in his chair and shook his head. "There's a lot to be said for knowing the value of hard work and not living on your father's dime." She couldn't see that, though. And that just makes it all the better that she chose someone else. You wouldn't want to be saddled with a woman who cared more about money than she did anything else, would you? Toby asked. At the same time, though, a wife deserves to be provided for. I wouldn't want to marry unless I knew I could put a roof over her head and feed her. Peter drained the rest of his lemonade, then turned back to Toby. What about you? Are you still saving for that house you want to build? I'm saving, but it still seems a long ways off. I'm worried that someone will take my spot before I'm ready. Your spot? Have you called dibs on it? Toby chuckled. Not in any way that matters yet. It's just felt like mine since the first time I saw it. The way the trees grow, the way the river bends, it creates the perfect picture, and I really can't imagine myself living anywhere else. Have you talked to your parents about staying in Topeka? They want you back in Wichita, don't they? Peter asked. Yes, they do. Toby played with his fork, not sure how to explain his current relationship with his parents. When Grandpa died and I came up here to help Grandma, my parents thought I'd only be gone a month or two. I get letters all the time asking when I'm coming back. But Topeka is where I grew up. They moved away, but my heart is here. And they don't understand that? No. And I've lost track of how many times I've tried to explain. I'm still looking for work that allows me to use my education. But once that's in place, I'll have what I need to be happy and self-sufficient, and everything they should want me to be. My mother's struggling with that concept, though. Peter chuckled. She wants you to stay young forever? Or living right next door, perhaps with a gate connecting my yard to hers. Toby stood up and put his plate on the sideboard. My grandma's just the opposite, though. She understands that children need to grow up and leave the nest. Maybe I should ask her to talk things over with my mother and give her some long-term perspective on the situation. The back door opened, and Nola entered the kitchen. She hung her shawl on the hook by the door before turning and smiling. Oh, hello, Peter. How are you? I'm doing well, Mrs. Johnson, and yourself? Quite well. Her voice trailed off as she looked at Peter's plate, and then her gaze flew over to the counter. Did you boys eat the chocolate cake? Yes, Toby replied, but not all of it. Is something wrong? Nola sat down on one of the kitchen chairs with a thump. You ate the cake. There was nearly always a cake or a pie or something available. What made this one different? Were you saving it for something, Grandma? This was a special cake, Nola replied. I made it for a person. Oh, no. Toby had spent the afternoon trying to correct one mistake only to turn around and make another. What sort of person? He asked, hoping she'd be a little more specific if he asked some leading questions. It's a surprise, and the cake was a surprise, and now there's no cake. Is there still a surprise? She looked exasperated. I'm not even sure there should be one now. You two, go find something to do while I clean up the kitchen. I need a moment. The kitchen already seemed spotless to Toby, but he knew that cleaning was his grandmother's way of relieving her feelings. And Peter, well, he looked ready to remove himself from the situation altogether. They headed out the back door with no need to be told twice. Toby shook his head as they descended the porch steps. Guess I shouldn't have cut the cake. Probably shouldn't have. Thanks for sharing it, though. Peter clapped Toby on the shoulder. I'd better get going. Hope you get things smoothed out with your grandmother. Oh, it'll be okay. She's a woman of infinite patience. And good luck with your little sister. Peter thanked him and headed back across the lawn the way he'd come, his shovel balanced over his shoulder. Toby picked up his shovel, knocked the dirt off it, and put it back in the shed, wondering how long he should stay outside. He felt bad about ruining his grandmother's offering for whoever it was, but he'd had no way of knowing it wasn't just one of the desserts she kept around on a regular basis. This person must be special if Nola was putting all this effort into impressing them. What if? Toby paused, his hand on the knob of the shed door. What if his grandmother had a new beau? What if some nice older gentleman had moved to town, and she'd made that cake for him? It had been a little while since grandfather had died, and Toby knew she'd been lonely. That's why he'd stayed. If she'd made a new friend, good for her. But who was this man? Was he really everything he claimed to be? Or was he some sort of swindler who preyed on innocent widows and stole their life savings? Toby felt his hackles rise. He'd be keeping an eye on this situation, for sure. Jane, I just don't know what to do with that boy. Jane put the armful of yarn she was carrying on the counter and looked at her friend. Nola had just come bursting into the shop, which was odd because Nola wasn't the sort to burst, and she looked genuinely upset. What's the matter, Nola? Nola sank into one of the chairs in the corner and fanned herself with her hand. Thora and I went over to see Esther and to welcome Miriam home. I asked Toby to come, and he said no because he was working in my flower beds. That was quite perturbing, but I did want the manure situation resolved, so I left him to it. We went by ourselves, and I promised Miriam a chocolate cake I made this morning. But when I got back, I saw that Toby had cut right into it and left a huge hole behind. First manure, now this. I need that boy married off. But if I can't even get him to come with me to see Miriam, he's going to live with me forever, isn't he? Do I just need to accept this and find ways not to dwell on it? Jane sat down next to her friend and patted her arm. It will all work out, Nola. Miriam will be here for a while. It's all right if he doesn't see her today. Did you tell him about the welcome home party? He can see her then. I didn't tell him because I didn't want to have to explain who the party was for and ruin the surprise. But it's ruined anyway. No chocolate cake. Jane tried to hide her smile. Nola did have a tendency to make things seem rather larger and more important than they really were. You have time to make another cake tonight, don't you? I suppose I could, especially since we don't start setting up for the party until 11. That would give it time to cool overnight, and I could frost it in the morning. Perfect. Why don't you go home? Tell Toby that he's coming to the party, and have him help you make the cake. I bet that once he realizes the work that goes into baking something like that, he'll have a healthier respect for it, and won't just gobble up everything he sees. Respect. I like that word. He's very respectful of me personally. But other things, like cake, he could do better. Nola gave a nod. You're always so logical. How do you manage it? Jane was a little taken aback at the question. Gracious, I don't know. That's just how my brain works, I suppose. Well, I wish mine would put in a little more effort. Some days it feels like it's just taking up space in my skull, and I should be charging it for rent. Nola hoisted herself to her feet. Thank you, Jane. You've made me feel so much better about things. I don't know how I did that, but you're welcome. The door closed behind Nola, and Jane went back to sorting her yarn. Poor Nola. Jane couldn't help but feel that learning to understand Toby would be good for her friend, but it might be a bumpy road to get there. Chapter 4. Toby, you're needed in the kitchen. Toby put down his book and stood up. He didn't mind the interruption. He hadn't actually been reading anyway. His brain had been churning, trying to come up with ways to learn more about his grandmother's mysterious bow. He didn't want to ask her directly. If she hadn't mentioned it to him, she must have a reason for keeping it a secret. He supposed he really ought to stay out of it. But how could he? She was so vulnerable. She could find herself in real trouble before she even knew what was happening. He decided that he ought to follow her for a day or two and see if he could spot her with some mysterious man. Then he could pretend to run into them accidentally, and that would force an introduction, and he'd have the chance to make sure this beau was aware of his existence and that he wasn't going to stand by and let his grandmother become a victim. With that decision made, he went downstairs to find his grandmother standing there, holding out an apron. "Put this on," she commanded. "You're going to help me make a new cake." I am?" "Yes, you are. We have just enough time to prepare it for tomorrow, but only if we hurry." "All right." Toby took the apron and tied it around his waist, feeling more than just a little silly. But he didn't want to irritate his grandmother further by refusing to put it on. "So tell me about tomorrow. What's the cake for?" "There's going to be a celebration of sorts, and someone I'd like you to meet." Oh, maybe Toby wouldn't need to sneak around after all. It sounded like his grandmother was ready to make the introductions herself. But a celebration? Like an engagement party? She wouldn't get engaged without saying anything, would she? "So you need to be at Esther's at 1 o'clock, Nola was saying. "Esther's at 1, he repeated. "That's right. This is important, Toby. I need you there." Toby nodded, even though his stomach was sinking. The urgency in her tone. She'd gotten engaged. He pulled in a deep breath. He'd pretend to be happy for her, but he would do whatever he could to investigate this man before the actual wedding took place. His grandmother wasn't wealthy, but she did have savings laid by, enough to tempt a person of low moral character. Nola asked him to fetch eggs, butter, and milk, and she walked him through what to do step by step. He was certain she could have done all this much more quickly on her own, but he knew she was trying to teach him a lesson, and he'd do as he was asked. As silly as the apron made him feel, he was glad of it because the flour went everywhere, and he was sure he looked like a jar of paste before he was done. Once the cake was in the oven, Toby turned to Nola and put his hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for teaching me how to do that, Grandma," he said. "It was actually kind of fun, and I promise I won't eat your special cakes any more." "Thank you, Toby," she replied. "I appreciate that." "I just wonder if we could put the special cakes in a different place, so I know they're special," Toby went on. She paused. "I never did tell you that cake was being saved for something, did I?" "No." "Oh dear, I'm sorry, Toby. I've just been a little frazzled lately." She sighed, shaking her head. "I'll keep anything special on the top shelf of this cupboard, all right? And I'll keep the regular desserts down here on the counter." "Thank you, Grandma." He gave her a kiss on the forehead. "Now, how else can I help?" He wiped off the table and washed up the dishes they'd used, all the while thinking about the frazzle she'd been in. Wedding plans, perhaps? Why wouldn't she just say it? Why was she making him wait until the next day? "Grandma, are you all right?" he finally asked as he dried the mixing bowl. "Is anything bothering you?" She looked up from her recipe book with wide eyes. Bothering me? No, I'm just getting ready to make supper. Why would anything be bothering me? No reason, I suppose. I just hope you know you can talk to me if something is bothering you. No, not at all. Everything's fine. She gave him an overly bright smile, and he nodded. Whatever it was, he'd find out the next day, and he needed to be calm and ready to handle it. She'd need him to be an anchor in the middle of her chaos, not an addition to the problem. Miriam heard rapid footsteps on the stairs and barely had time to open her bedroom door before Kitty Clark came barreling through. "You're here! You're really here!" Kitty caught Miriam in a hug, nearly suffocating her. "Yes, I'm here," Miriam said, laughing. "Now let me go so I can breathe." "I'm sorry." Kitty loosened her grip and stepped back. "I couldn't believe it when Grandma told me you were coming. It was like Christmas and all my birthdays wrapped up all at once. I would have written you directly, but there was too much to put in a letter, and I thought I'd rather tell you everything in person." Miriam ushered her best friend from childhood into her room and closed the door. There were things she didn't want her grandmother to know just yet. "It's so good to see you, Kit. There isn't anyone like you in New York." "I imagine there isn't anyone like me in the whole world," Kitty replied, taking a seat on the bed. "Now, come sit down and talk to me. I'm going to explode if I don't hear what's going on." Miriam sat down but paused, trying to decide where to begin. "I wrote you that I was seeing a man named Gerald." "Yes, you did, but that was ages ago, and you never did say much." "Well, he was a lawyer, and I'd gotten a job as a secretary in his office. At first, it was really boring work, but then I was able to assist on a few cases, and it became more interesting. Gerald and I were spending a lot of time together at the office, and he eventually asked me to attend the opera with him." "The opera," Kitty sighed. "Oh, how I'd love to go to the opera." "I thought you'd like that part of my story." Kitty had always been in love with music, and several times while Miriam had been gone, she'd thought about Kitty and wished she could share some of her cultural experiences with her friend. "After the opera, we started having dinner together, and it wasn't long until he proposed." "He proposed?" Kitty gasped. "You didn't tell me." "No, I never told anyone. I think I knew right from the beginning that it wasn't going to work out, so I kept it a secret as long as I could." Kitty nudged Miriam's elbow. "I'm so sorry. Did you love him?" "That's just it. I'm not entirely sure. He was handsome, and I was definitely attracted to him. But love? I don't know. I was fond of him. Does that count?" Kitty shook her head. "Fondness is what you feel for your cousin. It has nothing to do with romance at all." "That's what I figured." Miriam toyed with the fringe on one of her pillows. It didn't matter anyway, because he met someone else, a socialite who was the daughter of one of his partners, and he decided she would be more advantageous to his career than a secretary. "Did he say that?" Kitty was aghast. "Yes, he said that, and he treated me as though I'd set my sights too high. He told me that I should have realized he was far above my station, and that in the future I shouldn't go after someone who was clearly meant for greater things." Miriam felt the bile in her stomach rise as she repeated the words. I can't believe he'd say something like that." Kitty looked fit to wring a chicken's neck. Who? Miriam lifted a hand. "It's all in the past now, Kit. We broke it off. He announced his engagement to the other girl the very next day, and I packed my trunks for home. I couldn't stay there and face the ridicule. Everyone in the office had seen how our relationship had come about, but once it was called off, they adopted his same attitude, that I'd tried to manipulate him into a marriage he didn't want." "That makes me so angry." Kitty stood up and started pacing. "You've never chased after boys. You've never tried to get their attention or manipulate them into anything. They've been the ones chasing after you. And I remember when Toby—" She clapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I promised I'd never say that name, but I just said it." "It's all right." Miriam had known she'd have to face it sooner or later. You can't return to the place where your history was made without running into it around every corner. That's all in the past, too, and he's in Wichita now, so it's a moot point. Kitty pressed her lips together. "Well, actually—" "What?" "He's not in Wichita. He came back here." He did?" A random butterfly flitted through Miriam's stomach, but she ignored it. "I heard that he'd moved." "His family did. But when Nola's husband died, Toby decided to give her a hand. He's been here ever since." "I didn't know that part." Miriam resumed, playing with the fringe. That meant she could run into him anywhere. She'd just have to expect it, prepare for it, and deal with it the best she could. They were both adults now. She imagined they could behave themselves. "Are you still angry with him?" Miriam sighed. "Oh, I don't know that I'm angry. It was more a feeling of betrayal. Maybe we should go back to talking about Gerald. That might be more comfortable." "I'm sorry." Kitty bent over and gave Miriam a hug. "I've never known when to be quiet. But I like your candidness. It keeps things interesting." Kitty laughed. "Interesting. That's a good word for it." It was probably best to change the subject altogether, so Miriam asked about her other friends from school. She was surprised at how many were still unmarried. "Grandma says it's because everyone's focusing on building up their land right now. They think it's more important to plow their fields than get married." "How is Bonnie doing?" Miriam asked. "You haven't said yet." "She's doing well. She's gotten involved in that new sewing circle Jane Henderson started in her shop, and she enjoys her friends there." "Jane Henderson has a shop?" Kitty laughed. "I keep forgetting how much we have to catch up on." "Yes, it's the cutest little place. It's half a block from Applebee's general store, and she carries yarn, thread, fabric, anything you'd need for a sewing project. She started it after her husband died, and she's taken the widows of Topeka under her wing. They get together and sew once a week there in her shop, and it's been so good for Grandma. Esther goes too. She probably hasn't had the chance to mention it. We haven't talked a lot yet. I've just been unpacking since supper." Kitty leaned over and touched one of the dresses lying on top of an open trunk. "This is sure pretty. I was thinking about wearing it to the party tomorrow." "You should. You've always looked beautiful in this shade of pink with your dark hair." "Thank you. I wondered if it was too fancy." Kitty shook her head. "You've just come from New York. Everyone's expecting you to look fancy. If you don't, they'll be disappointed." Miriam laughed. "All right, I'll wear the fancy dress so I'm not disappointing anyone." Kitty hopped off the bed. "Good girl. Now, I wish I could stay longer, but I promised Mother I'd be home to help put the twins to bed. They've been extra fractious lately." She gave Miriam another quick hug. "I'll see you tomorrow, and I'm so glad you're home." She bounced down the stairs, and Miriam watched her go with a smile. Kitty always did cheer her up. She felt terrible, though, that she still couldn't promise to stay. She'd been in Topeka only a few hours now, and she was already feeling restless, as though her feet were halfway down the sidewalk toward the train station. When would she ever feel comfortable where she was, without wanting more? Chapter 5. Toby didn't sleep well that night. His grandmother would be making her announcement that afternoon, and all his questions would be answered. But he didn't feel he'd be ready to face that announcement until he had more information. He got up early, bathed and dressed, then headed down to Main Street, hoping to catch Mr. Burns before the man became busy for the day. He opened the door of the newspaper office and stepped inside. The press was still quiet, but a typesetter worked diligently in the corner. Toby pulled in a deep breath. He loved the smell of paper and ink. He felt the same way about that aroma as some people did about lilac bushes in the spring. "Good morning," Isaiah Burns called, walking out of his office and extending a hand. "What brings you by this morning, Toby?" "A matter of a somewhat personal nature," Toby replied. "Do you mind if we go back in your office?" Isaiah gave a nod and led the way. Once both men were seated, Toby came right to the point. "You know the citizens of this town better than just about anyone. Are you aware if my grandmother is being courted by someone?" "Your grandmother?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "No, not that I'm aware of. She's a bit past that age, isn't she?" "Perhaps, but it's been known to happen." "What makes you think she has a suitor?" Toby settled back in his chair. "She's been dropping little hints lately, and she seems more flustered than usual. She told me she's planning to make an announcement this afternoon, but she didn't say what it was about. I'm worried that whoever this man is, he might not have the best of intentions." "Meaning you think he's going to steal from her?" "Exactly. I hoped you might know something about the situation." Isaiah shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I haven't seen or heard anything of the kind. If there is such a man prowling around, he's keeping himself well hidden. I'll see what I can find out, though." "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Toby started to rise, but Isaiah shook his head. "Hold up there a minute, Toby. I'm glad you came by. I was actually planning to come see you this morning, and when you walked in I thought you'd caught wind of my visit and had decided to save me a trip." "You were coming to see me?" "I was. You and I have talked quite a bit about the newspaper business over the last few years, and you've expressed interest in the field." "That's right." "Well, turns out that Walter Reeves is leaving the paper, and I need to fill his post. Are you interested in applying?" Toby couldn't respond for a moment. He felt as though he'd just been blasted by an Arctic wind and was now frozen to his chair. "You'd like me to apply to be a reporter?" he said at last. "That's right. Your education is right in line with what I need, and you've got a good head on your shoulders. I feel I could trust you to tell an unbiased story. What do you say?" Toby managed to pull in a breath. This was exactly the opportunity he'd been looking for, and he needed to stay calm so he wouldn't ruin his chances. "What would you like me to do?" "I'd like you to write 2 articles and have them on my desk by 5 o'clock tonight. The first will be a piece about the potential for spring flooding down along the riverbank, and the second will be a society piece." Isaiah smirked. "I'd like to get your unique perspective on the shindig at Esther Brown's house this afternoon." You want me to write about my grandmother's engagement announcement?" That was odd. If Isaiah hadn't even known his grandmother was being courted, how would he know about this? "No, I'm talking about—" Isaiah paused. "You don't know?" "About what?" Isaiah leaned back and laughed. "Just be at Esther Brown's at 1 o'clock this afternoon, and have both articles on my desk at 5. There are a few other applicants, but not many, and frankly you're my pick for the job, if you can prove that you have what it takes." "Thank you. I appreciate it." Toby shook Isaiah's hand and left the building, elated at the opportunity, but also confused by much of the conversation. He wasn't going to waste time trying to figure it out, though. It would all make sense soon enough, he supposed. He'd stop at the Brody Hotel, eat some breakfast, then head down to the river. He had an article to write that morning. Esther's friends had converged upon the house at 11 sharp and had forbidden Miriam to come anywhere near the kitchen or the backyard. "We have everything well in hand," Thora told her. "You relax and enjoy your day." That was nice enough in theory, But Miriam found it impossible to relax when she knew other people were working. So she went into the parlor, found her grandmother's mending basket, and made herself useful by replacing some buttons on a blouse. The whole time she worked, as hard as she tried to keep herself distracted, her thoughts kept wandering back to her conversation with Kitty, particularly the part about Toby. Oh, Toby. She'd never in her life felt about anyone the way she had about him. He was simply perfect. She'd met him when he was 12 and she was 10, and she looked up to him as though he was some sort of fairy tale prince. He was tall for his age, not gangly like the other boys, and he didn't ignore the girls or tease them. If they wanted to play stickball, he'd hand them the stick and give them a chance. As if that wasn't impressive enough, he'd helped rescue a puppy that had gotten swept up in the current of the river. Miriam remembered it clearly. She and some of her friends were standing on the bank, watching in horror as the poor little creature struggled against the water. But Toby hadn't hesitated even for a moment. He'd waded out into the river, scooped the animal up, and carried it back to the shore without giving any thought for his own safety. On that day, every girl in Miriam's school declared that she was going to marry Toby someday. Miriam was the one who meant it the most. Ouch! She muttered as she stabbed her finger with the needle. She shouldn't let herself get distracted while working with sharp implements. Miriam, are you in here? Yes, I'm in the parlor, Miriam called out as she grabbed a handkerchief to press against the drop of blood she'd produced. Kitty entered the room and sat down on the nearest chair. I've been sent to tell you that you may come outside in 10 minutes. That's good. I hate being in exile. Miriam handed the blouse to Kitty. Do you mind finishing that button while I make sure I'm not going to leave spots all over Grandma's mending? You've been impaling yourself, have you? Yes, and it's Toby's fault. Or maybe I should blame you for bringing him up last night. I'm sorry, it really was an accident. I know. And he shouldn't be off limits. That would be ridiculous, considering that we live in the same town and we're likely to run into each other. That thought made her stomach churn. Seeing him again was inevitable. But what would she say to him? Was there some sort of etiquette for running into the boy you'd once thought you were going to marry? Everything will work out, I'm sure of it. You'll see each other, you'll have a few awkward moments, and then you'll laugh about it. Kitty tied off the button and trimmed the loose threads. There you go. Now you can stop bleeding all over. Thank you. Miriam chipped her finger to make sure it was fine, then returned her handkerchief to her pocket. So, what have the grandmothers been doing out there anyway? From the snippets I've heard through the window, it's quite the to-do. There are decorations everywhere, tables with cakes and punch, another table to hold the gifts people will bring you. Gifts? Why are they bringing me gifts? Because they're really nice people and they love you. But I don't need gifts. Miriam put her grandmother's sewing basket back in the corner. Aren't they taking this a bit too far? They don't know how else to show you how glad they are that you've come home, Kitty replied. But I'm not even sure I'm staying. What? Kitty came out of her chair as though she'd been jabbed by Miriam's needle, too. I thought you were here for good. They all think you're here for good. I told my grandmother I'd be here through the summer. I never said what I'd be doing after that. Kitty sat back down, looking hurt. But why would you leave again? I don't know, Kit. I'm just not happy here. I'm not happy anywhere, I guess. So if you're going to be miserable, why not be miserable here with us? Miriam didn't know how to respond to that. Kitty must have sensed that she'd said something hurtful because she was immediately on her feet again, wrapping her arm around Miriam's shoulders. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound so harsh. What I meant to say was, wouldn't it be easier to figure out why you're so unhappy if you were here, surrounded by people who love you? We would help you, and maybe after a while you'd feel better. I don't know, Kit. That sounds simple enough, but in actuality, Esther came into the parlor, her face aglow. "Are you ready?" "Yes, we're on our way." "Good. Oh, I hope you'll like it." "Grandma, you know I'll love anything you've put together." Esther reached out and took Miriam's hand. "Then come. We're all waiting." When Miriam stepped into the backyard, she was overwhelmed. The ladies had put ribbons in all the trees, bunting along the porch rails, and lanterns along the edges of the lawn. She wondered if they were meant to be useful or decorative. The party wasn't going to last until after dark, was it? She wasn't sure she had the stamina. Several tables had been set up all over the lawn with matching chairs, and there were 2 long tables filled from edge to edge with food. "Oh my," Miriam said, trying to take it all in. "This looks beautiful. Please tell me you didn't move all this furniture yourself?" "Goodness, no," Maud Thomas replied. "A few of our sons and grandsons came over to help. They'll be back for some cake after they've cleaned up." "This is the loveliest party I've ever seen." Miriam swallowed around the lump in her throat. "Thank you so much. I don't deserve it." "Nonsense," Viola Spencer said from her nearby chair. "And if we only got what we deserved, none of us would have anything." "That's very true." Miriam turned in a circle to make sure she'd seen everything. "Thank you again. I'm going to remember this forever as the nicest thing anyone's ever done for me." Esther beamed. "I was worried that you'd think it was too much." "Well, I do. But that's not always a bad thing, is it?" Miriam chuckled, and the ladies laughed with her. "Now, I'd better run upstairs and change so I look ready for a party." Kitty came with her to help manage the buttons, and within a few minutes they were returning. Guests had already started to arrive, and Miriam took a deep breath before stepping off the porch and walking around to greet everyone. She had nothing to be nervous about, and yet she still felt butterflies in her stomach. What could she give these good people in return for everything they had given her? And would she ever feel like she'd lived up to their expectations?
Chapter 6. Toby got back to his grandmother's house as quickly as he could, and changed out of his mud-spattered pants and shoes. Turned out it was very difficult to research a story about flooding by the river without getting a little damp, but he was pleased with what he'd accomplished. Not only had he taken note of some areas where the banks seemed most vulnerable, but he'd spoken with some of the people who lived along those banks and asked for their thoughts on the situation. They shared some of the things they'd experienced when the river ran high in previous years, and he felt that their quotes would add validity to the piece. Once he'd changed, he sat down and began the article, knowing that he'd have to finish it after the party, but if he could get a good start on it now, that would put him on track. His grandmother wasn't home, but she'd left a note on the table reminding him to be at Esther's at 1 o'clock. It wasn't likely that he'd forget, not with 2 such compelling reasons to be there. At 1:45 he blotted his page, grabbed his hat and coat, and headed out, facing what needed to be done. He wasn't pleased with Isaiah for asking him to write about his grandmother's surprise engagement. But if he became a reporter, he'd have to write about a great many unpleasant things, and he supposed it was better to get over the shock of it now, so he could plunge right into the actual work once it began. He was determined to get this job, so he'd do what it took to ensure it. Esther Brown's yard looked lovely. He took a moment to note the colors of the decorations and the types of refreshments being served. The readers of the society column loved those kinds of details. Then he glanced around, looking for his grandmother. She was over by the punch bowl, handing a glass to an older gentleman with a small goatee. So, that was him. The man who planned to rob his grandmother blind. Toby crossed the lawn, his notes for the article fisted in one hand. He wasn't sure what he would say, or if he should even be approaching them. But his feet seemed to be moving of their own accord,
and he wasn't sure he could pull himself back now. "Grandmother," he said, his jaw tense. "Oh, hello, Toby. You made it." Nola's hand shook a little, and she glanced over her shoulder. "I'm glad you're here." "You asked me to come, so I came." Toby nodded toward the man with the goatee. "Who's your friend?" "Oh, this is Rudolph Green. He moved to town not long ago." "Mr. Green, this is my grandson, Toby." "Pleased to meet you, son." Mr. Green stuck out his hand, a smile on his face, and Toby obliged. "Your grandmother was just telling me what a help you've been these last couple of years." Toby glanced at Nola. She was still plainly rattled, and he wondered how she could feel right about this decision when it was causing her so much turmoil just announcing it. Surely she understood that if this was the right thing, she'd feel more peaceful about it. "I've just done what I could," Toby replied to Mr. Green. "So, where did you live before you came to Topeka? Do you have a family?" Before Mr. Green could reply, Nola let out a gasp, and Toby turned to see the cause. Miriam Brown was descending the porch steps wearing a deep pink gown that made her cheeks glow and her lips look kissable and her hair shine in the afternoon sunlight, and he honestly went weak in the knees. "Miriam?" he said, blinking. "Miriam's here?" "Yes," Nola said, clapping her hands and then tucking them under her chin. "Surprise!" Toby took a step backward, unable to take his eyes off Miriam. She was twice as beautiful as he remembered, but there was something he'd noticed. Memories tended to dim the true beauty of certain things, or to exaggerate the beauty of others. His thoughts of her hadn't done her justice, and now he could hardly breathe. He finally pulled his eyes away and looked over at his grandmother. She was watching him carefully, studying him, and he realized she was gauging his reaction like a hawk watches prey. "Where did Mr. Green go?" "Mr. Green?" She looked around. "Oh, there he is, under that tree with his wife." "His wife?" Toby shook his head. "Grandma, he's married?" "Yes, is something wrong?" Toby looked over at Mr. Green, then back at Nola. You're not engaged to him?" She dropped the punch ladle into the bowl, and it made a clattering sound. "Toby Johnson, what on earth are you talking about? Why would I be engaged to a married man?" "So, who are you engaged to?" "I'm not engaged to anyone. Who put that ridiculous idea in your head?" I thought..." Toby tried to remember, his cheeks flushing, as he realized how very wrong he'd been. "I jumped to a lot of conclusions, I guess." "I should say so. Now would you please go over there and say hello to Miriam? She'll think you're avoiding her." Perhaps he did want to avoid her, but he couldn't say it aloud. He pulled in a deep breath, trying to overcome his surprise that his grandmother wasn't secretly being courted after all, and prepared himself to face the only young woman he'd ever truly loved. Of course, they were bound to see each other again someday. As long as he chose to leave in Topeka, it was inevitable. Maybe that's why he'd fallen in love with a spot of ground here, why he couldn't see himself living anywhere else. Maybe he'd been hoping for this moment all along, or maybe he just really liked that spot of land. He edged his way through the crowd of well-wishers and stood a few yards beyond her right elbow, waiting for those who were speaking to her to move on. He knew the moment she became aware of him. Her spine stiffened, and she took a breath, and then she turned a little so he couldn't see her face. It wasn't a complete rejection, but it was just enough, and he almost turned and walked away. But he wanted answers, and he wasn't going to give up so easily. The people strolled off, leaving Miriam alone, and Toby waited. She finally turned and acknowledged him. "Hello, Toby." "Hello, Miriam. It's good to see you." She nodded. "I heard you moved away. I was surprised to find out you're in town."
My family moved, but Topeka's always been my home." She made a little sound that was almost a grunt, but he'd never offend her by calling it that. "Thank you for coming to the party. If you'll excuse me, more guests are arriving and I should go say hello." So they were nearly strangers, were they? Well, Toby could return like for like. "I'm here on assignment for the newspaper. Do you have a moment later to give me a quote about the party and what it's like to be back?" "Assignment?" "That's right." "I'm sure that would be fine. Why don't we say in an hour?" "All right, I'll be waiting." She walked off, leaving Toby standing there like a pillar of salt. He'd wanted to reach out and touch her, to see if coming in contact with him would remind her of everything they'd once been to each other, but he kept his hands at his sides. Maybe he didn't want to reawaken those feelings. Maybe they were best left buried. There were far too many maybes. He wandered off to the dessert table and smiled when he saw the cake he'd helped his grandmother make. He'd been so foolish to think she was getting married, but how was he ever to have guessed that the cake was for Miriam's homecoming party? Why didn't Nola just say so? He picked up a plate with a slice of Thora's spice cake and walked back over to the punch table, where Nola was just as busy as before. He waited until she had a pause before he spoke. "Grandma, why didn't you tell me Miriam was coming home?" Nola turned to him with a smile. "Because I wanted it to be a surprise. Isn't it a lovely surprise, Toby?" "Yes, it is. I just wonder. Well, some advance warning would have been nice, too." "Advance warning? You make the girl sound like a thunderstorm of something." Perhaps that description was a lot more accurate than Nola knew. "So you're sure you're not getting married?" he asked, his tone lighter. "I'm quite sure, and if I ever do start to court again, I'll discuss it with you first. Does that suit your sensibilities?" "Yes, I think that will do nicely." He accepted a glass of punch, then set off to mingle with the guests and get some quotes about their experiences at the party. No matter where he went or how many people he talked to, though, he felt drawn toward Miriam, as though he had a rope attaching himself to her. It had always been that way, though, at least since the day he'd opened his eyes and really noticed her. He interviewed Jane Henderson and Bonnie Clark, two of his grandmother's friends who had helped set up the party. And then he spoke with Kitty Clark, Bonnie's granddaughter, and also Miriam's good friend. "Hello, Kitty," he said as he approached her. "You're looking well." "Thank you. You look like you've seen a ghost." That's such a cliché, but it's so fitting for this moment. "I rather feel like I've seen a ghost. I had no idea Miriam was coming back into town." Kitty nodded. "And now that she's here—" Toby exhaled loudly. "I'm not sure. She's agreed to talk with me for my newspaper article, but beyond that, I have no idea. What do you think, Kitty? You know her better than anyone." Kitty shook her head, making her blonde curls bounce. "I don't know for sure what all happened between the two of you, and I'm not sure I want to know. You might have to navigate this one alone." It was odd to Toby that Miriam hadn't confided in her best friend. He'd always thought that's why girls had best friends, so they'd have someone to share those sorts of things with. "Fair enough. So would you like to be quoted in the newspaper? What do you think of the party?" He didn't actually know if Isaiah planned to use the article, so he shouldn't promise they'd be in the paper. He shook his head, thinking about Isaiah. The man knew the whole time that Nola wasn't getting engaged, that this was a homecoming for Miriam, and Toby wanted to wring his neck for withholding the secret. He had to admit, though, that it had been a good joke, and for that reason alone, perhaps Isaiah could keep his neck. Toby would have to consider it. He jotted down Kitty's comments, thanked her, and moved along, stopping next to his friend Peter, who was leaning against one of the trees. "So, Miriam's back," Peter said with a degree of amusement in his voice. "I saw you speaking with her a minute ago."
I'm not sure that was actually speaking, Toby replied. I was speaking, and she was barely acknowledging. Oh, that's more than you had yesterday, Peter pointed out. What's next? Next, I interview her for the paper. Toby held up his sheet of notes. Isaiah Burns asked me to apply for a job, and if I do well, I'll become a reporter. That's fantastic. Sounds like your hard work is going to pay off. I sure hope so. College wasn't easy for me. I'd like to see it render me some good. A flash of red caught Toby's eye, and he turned to see a little girl of about 6 years old go dashing through the crowd on her way to the cake display. I see that Eliza is still enjoying her red dress. Yes, she is. In fact, she didn't want to take it off last night. Mother has been saying that she might need to ask grandmother to sew a red nightdress. That would be a sight, Toby chuckled. So would you like to add anything to this article? It's your chance to be famous, to see your name in print. If they use it, that is. This could just be a practice piece. No, thank you. Peter had suddenly become distracted by something over Toby's shoulder. Who's that? Toby turned to see a beautiful auburn-haired lady stepping across the grass, looking around uncertainly. I don't know. I've never seen her before. I think I need to introduce myself. Excuse me. Peter walked off before Toby even replied, and Toby grinned. Peter always did have an eye for pretty ladies. He talked with the newcomer for a minute, then 2 children came running up and took her hands, pulling her toward the dessert table, leaving Peter standing there alone. That must have been a cruel rejection, and awkward, to have approached a married woman like that. I have a moment now, if you're free. Toby had been about to go check on his friend, but at the sound of Miriam's voice, he turned and smiled. Of course. Shall we sit? He motioned to the bench nearest the tree. Miriam sat, then smoothed her skirt across her knee. What would you like to know? What brings you to town? How do you find it here? And how long do you intend to stay? Toby waited, his pencil hovering over his paper, for her to speak. I'm here to visit my grandmother. I find it much changed, and I'm not sure yet how long I intend to stay. He waited for her to elaborate, and when she didn't, he decided he'd better go in with some follow-up questions, or he'd never get the kind of article he wanted. You were living in New York, correct? That's right. And what were you doing in New York? I was a secretary at a law firm. Her answers were crisp, precise, and utterly boring. He looked up at her, shaking his head. If you didn't want to be interviewed, why didn't you just say so? She blinked. What do you mean? You know what I mean, Miriam. You're sitting there as stiff as a washing board. You're hardly speaking to me, and I think you'd be more polite to a total stranger. I can finish this article with or without you, so it's your choice. Either give me something I can work with, or I'll move on to someone else. He prepared to stand up. She lifted a hand. You're right. I'm being unfair, and I'm sorry. Tell me what you'd like to know, and I'll try harder. Toby readied his pencil. You say you were living in New York. What's your favorite part about the time you spent there? I would say that leaving was my favorite part, but that doesn't help your article. I enjoyed the museums, the opera, the ballet, and the wide variety of restaurants and other social outlets. But I missed the quiet intimacy of Topeka. Toby scribbled all that down. You enjoyed leaving New York? Very much. But you don't need to include that. In fact, I wish you wouldn't. All right, I won't. He crossed out that line, then met her gaze. What would you say has changed about Topeka since you were here last? There are more stores, more houses, and things are definitely busier. I went for a walk this morning and only recognized a handful of the people I passed. It's exciting to see our town expanding. And what are you hoping to do or see before you leave again? Toby tried to keep his voice neutral. He hadn't even known she was coming, and now they were discussing her leaving again. It was far too soon for such talks.
Spending time with my grandmother, of course. I'm looking forward to the peace and quiet of home, visiting with friends, taking a few naps, a chance to be still for a while. I imagine it's much quieter here than in New York. Very much so. It will be a welcome change. Just then a little girl came running across the lawn toward them, and Toby recognized her as the child who had interrupted Peter and his new auburn-haired acquaintance earlier. "Miriam Brown, there you are! Mama said this was your party, so you had to be here even though I couldn't see you, and if I looked around I'd find you." "Hello, Princess Amaryllis." Miriam bent over and gave the girl a hug. "Yes, I'm right here, and I'm glad you came to the party. How did you find out about it? I didn't even know about it until last night." The child scrunched up her nose. "I think your grandma met my mama at the store, or something. Anyway, it was this morning, and your grandma was so excited, I think she was inviting everyone in the whole world." "She may have been," Miriam said with a laugh. She turned to Toby. "I met Princess Amaryllis on the train just before we reached Topeka. She and her family are new here." Toby gave the girl a nod. "It's nice to meet you. What do you think of the party?" "Oh, I think it's the most beautiful party ever, and when I grow up, I want to have one just like it." She paused and looked at Toby with a scrutinizing eye. "Why are you sitting here under this tree? Mama says that when a boy takes a girl under a tree, he wants to kiss her. Are you going to kiss Miriam Brown?" Toby swallowed. "I'm interviewing her for the newspaper." She raised an eyebrow. "But that doesn't sound like kissing." "That's because it's not." "Well, when does the kissing part start?" Toby wasn't sure how to respond. This little girl should be a reporter herself. She certainly knew how to ask questions. "Have you met Eliza Thomas?" "Who?" "That little girl in the red dress." He nodded toward the refreshment table. "No, I haven't. Is she nice?" "She's very nice, and I think she's close to your age. Why don't you go say hello?" "All right, but if you start kissing, you have to tell me." She called this out over her shoulder as she ran, causing many people standing nearby to chuckle. Toby turned back to Miriam, his face hot. "I'm sorry about that." Miriam was grinning. "I don't think I've ever seen you so rattled. That one would certainly keep you on your toes." He glanced down at his notes, trying to remember what they'd even been talking about. "Is there anything else you'd like me to include?" "Yes. Say how touched I am that the ladies of our community put together this wonderful party for me. It was such a nice way to be welcomed home." "Will do." Toby stood, then paused. "Miriam, when can I see you again?" She looked away. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why wouldn't it be?" Because things are best left in the past, don't you think? Why would we open up old wounds when they've already healed over? Maybe they haven't healed over. Maybe they've just been bandaged." She stood up and extended her hand. "It was nice to see you again, Toby, and I appreciate the interview. I think it's best if we say our goodbyes now. Best of luck in all your future endeavors." He barely had time to squeeze her fingers before she was striding off toward the house, her skirts swishing on the grass. She did have a way of leaving the scene quickly when she felt uncomfortable. He watched her go, then left too, feeling as though he had enough information for both articles. Now it was a matter of writing them up and getting them down to the newspaper office on time. That's where his focus needed to be. He wanted this next step in his career, and he couldn't let anyone distract him from that goal. As he walked away, he noticed two little girls, one in red and one in blue, twirling around to see whose skirt was poofier, and he smiled. Chapter 7. "Isaiah, I have a bone to pick with you." Isaiah Burns looked up from his desk. "Yes? What might that be?" "You knew my grandmother wasn't getting engaged, and you knew Miriam Brown was home for a visit." Isaiah laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, and it was fun watching your confusion. Not much amuses me in this line of work. I have to find my entertainment where I'm able."
Well, I'm glad I could add something to liven up your boring day." Toby shook his head even as he smiled. If he'd been in Isaiah's place, he likely would have done the same thing. "I've brought you something. 2 somethings, actually." He slid his articles across the desk. "I look forward to hearing what you think." "Wait, you aren't leaving, are you? Sit down. Make yourself comfortable." Isaiah picked up the sheets of paper and began to read. "You're going to look those over while I'm still here?" Toby asked. "Well, yes. Don't you want to know what I think?" "Of course, but I thought you'd read them after I left, in private." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "In other words, you're nervous about seeing my initial reaction, and you want to get out of here." "That might be accurate. Sit down, Toby." Toby sat. "If you're going to be in the newspaper business, you have to get used to this sort of thing. People will be reading your articles out there on the sidewalk, sitting on either side of you on the train, at the next table if you go to a restaurant. You have to stand behind your work, hold your head up high, and be prepared to defend your facts and your witnesses. You can't afford to be shy." "Understood." Toby leaned back in his chair. "I'm hereby ready for any facial expressions you might have or guffaws you might emit while you read." "Good, because I'll be honest with you. I wouldn't have it any other way." Despite Toby's joking that he could take the criticism, it was still difficult to sit there and wait to hear Isaiah's opinion. He'd never written up an assignment so quickly. In college, he'd always had a few days or a week to complete each task. But that was a luxury that simply didn't exist if he was going to write for the newspaper. If something time-sensitive was taking place, he might have a matter of just a few minutes to construct his story before he needed to put it in the hands of the typesetter. Isaiah didn't guffaw as he read. He didn't even twitch a facial muscle. That was almost worse than if he'd grimaced or yawned. It felt like years went by before he finally laid the pages on his desk and looked at Toby. "How do you think you did?" he asked. Well, Toby had never been asked that sort of thing before. He'd always been assigned a grade, and that was that. "I believe I did fairly well considering these were my first articles. I captured some human interest. I included facts and figures. I remained neutral throughout, and I know my spelling and grammar are correct. I think that with some practice I could be quite good." "And I agree." Isaiah tapped the pages. "I see potential here, Toby, and I'd like to offer you the job." Toby's heart gave a thump, and he struggled to remain calm on the outside. "Thank you, Mr. Burns. You realize you do have a lot to learn, so the pay won't be quite as much to start. But once you've got some experience under your belt, this could be a smart career move for you." "Thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity." "Well, don't thank me yet. You'll have several more parties to attend and cakes to describe before you're done. I'll still be handling the really juicy stories until you've got a little less peach fuzz. Keep up the good work, Toby. You'll be there in no time." They discussed his starting salary, which wasn't impressive, but wasn't as small as Toby had feared, and they agreed that he would start the following Monday morning. Then they shook hands, and he left feeling a little light-headed. He'd done it. He'd just gotten a job working for the newspaper. He wouldn't be digging ditches or hauling logs anymore, unless someone needed extra help. He couldn't picture himself turning down the chance to make additional money, but for the most part, he was going to be a reporter. A genuine newspaper reporter, using his brains instead of his back to earn his living. It felt good. He'd go home and write his parents, of course. Hopefully they'd start to understand why staying in Topeka was so important to him. His grandmother would be overjoyed, he was sure. And Miriam? He wanted to tell her first of all. But she'd bid him goodbye that afternoon. She wasn't interested in anything he had to say. They weren't friends anymore, and he needed to accept that. Or did he?
She always had been the most stubborn girl he'd ever met. Maybe he needed to be equally as stubborn and insist that she listen to him. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd said, but he did know that he deserved another chance. It would be helpful if he knew why she'd become so angry with him in the first place. He'd go talk to her in the morning. Church services didn't start until 10, giving him plenty of time to show up at her house, plead his case, and see if he could get her to see reason. If he couldn't, maybe an hour of sermonizing and singing would loosen her up. Pastor Osborne was always good for interpreting the Spirit and making things plain. First, though, he had some good news to share with his grandmother. The party ended just before sunset. After her chat with Toby, Miriam had gone upstairs for a moment to collect herself, and then she'd spent the rest of the day smiling, visiting, and catching up with her old friends and acquaintances. When the last person finally left, she sank into a chair on the porch, watching Peter Thomas and his father load tables and chairs into their wagon to be taken to their rightful owners. When Esther sat down next to her, Miriam reached over and touched her grandmother's hand. "Thank you so much. I can't believe how hard you worked on this." "It was my pleasure, sweetheart, and I had so much help." "Your friends really are wonderful. I didn't get the chance to visit with them as much as I wanted, though. You should come with me to my sewing circle meeting. I'm sure they've all got dozens of questions to pepper you with." "Oh, I don't think I could interrupt your meeting like that." Plus, Miriam couldn't stand the idea of being peppered with questions. She couldn't even answer the few that had been posed to her that day. She cringed as she thought about her conversation with Toby. That had gone so horribly wrong. She'd meant to be calm, dignified, and gracious. Instead, she'd been cold, shallow, and rude. It seemed she hadn't matured at all where Toby was concerned. "Nonsense, my dear. You'd be our special guest, not an interruption. And you'd love Jane's shop. She's got it set up as nicely as can be. Kitty was telling me about it. I'm surprised Jane's able to stay competitive with Applebee's. They've carried all the sewing supplies in this part of town for years now." Esther chuckled. "Well, now, that's just another evidence of the goodness of people. When Jane's husband died and she needed a way to make a living, it was actually Mr. Appleby who suggested that she open up a shop. He told her that he was finding it hard to carry so many different things in his store, and if she'd take over the sewing goods, he'd be obliged to her." "He did?" "That's right. And he helped her get in contact with the various suppliers and everything. Now, the only sewing goods left in Applebee's are the leftover bits of stock he hasn't sold yet. He hasn't reordered anything since Jane opened." "But that must be costing him quite a lot in sales," Miriam said. "How can he afford to be so generous?" "He says he can't afford not to be. If he can't take care of the widows, he can't call himself a Christian. Jane doesn't know any of this, though. Only a few of us do, because we helped him talk her into it. And the shop has helped all of us. We have a place to meet and share our sorrows now." Miriam wiped away the unexpected tear that appeared on her cheek. "Oh, that's just wonderful. What a blessing for all of you." "Yes, and it's one of the reasons why I love it here so much, and why I hoped you'd love it here too." Esther peered at Miriam curiously, and Miriam knew the moment she'd been dreading had come. "Why aren't you happy here, my dear?" "Oh, Grandma, it's not that I'm unhappy here, I'm unhappy everywhere." Esther's eyes filled with tears, and Miriam felt terrible. She hadn't meant to make her grandmother cry. "You've always had a deep sadness in you, something I didn't know how to fix, and I hoped it would leave you someday, but it hasn't." Miriam shook her head. "No, it hasn't. And every time I leave, I have this wild idea in my head that maybe I'll be happier in the new place, that I'll find what I'm looking for. But it never happens. Kitty told me I should stay here and get myself sorted out around people who love me instead of running off again. And she's probably right. But what if it doesn't work?" Esther reached over and took Miriam's hand. "Sweetheart, if you're looking for what I think you're looking for. This is the only place where you can find it. And what am I looking for? If I knew that, I'm sure it would be easier to find. Your mother and father, Esther replied. Miriam's breath caught in her chest. What do you mean? How can I be looking for them when they're dead? You're looking for the way you used to feel when you were around them. You're looking for your mother's cuddles, and the way your father would swing you around when he picked you up. You're looking for family. Miriam pulled out her handkerchief and wiped her cheeks. But I'll never find those things. She can't cuddle me. He can't swing me around. That's over now. Those things are over, but family isn't. Esther looked at her with shining eyes. Do you have any idea how much I love you? I know, or maybe I don't know because I don't have any grandchildren of my own, so I can only pretend to understand. It's a whole lot, though. Yes, it's a whole lot. Esther wiped at her eyes. That night, that horrible night, we lost our son, and we lost our daughter-in-law. But you were spared, and we always felt that was a blessing, specifically for us. If you'd been taken too, I don't know how we ever could have survived our grief. I sometimes wonder if it would have been better if I died too, Miriam said, her voice low. Oh, sweetheart, don't feel that way. Esther wiped her eyes again. You've been the light in my life. You've given me something to focus on and pray about and be proud of. And now that your grandfather is gone, if I didn't have you, I'd be all alone in the world. Please, don't ever wish that, for my sake, if nothing else. This poor little old woman needs you. Miriam slid to her knees and buried her head in her grandmother's lap. I'm sorry, Grandma, she managed to choke out after a moment had gone by. I should have been here the whole time. I shouldn't have left you so often. You were doing what you thought you needed to do, Esther soothed, stroking Miriam's hair. I knew that even when I didn't fully understand it. But if I'd stayed, we're not going to dwell on the past, sweetheart. It won't do anyone any good. Let's think about the future, all right? Let's think about ways to find all the missing pieces and make you whole again. Miriam lifted her face and looked into her grandmother's kindly eyes. I think talking to you is a very good first step. I think so too, and we should keep talking as much as we need to and for as long as we need to. This isn't a burden you ever needed to carry alone. I remember you telling me that years ago, but I never listened, did I? No, and I blame your father for that. He was the most stubborn man alive, and he must have passed that trait down to you. Esther chuckled. You're so very like him. It makes me happy to see him in you. Even when I'm being stubborn? Yes, even then. I often thought I'd never be able to raise him to adulthood, but we both made it, and he became a very nice young man and a good father. Do you remember your parents very well? Both of them, Miriam replied. Sometimes when I can't sleep at night, I'll pull out all my memories and relive them. That's a nice thing to do. I might have to try that. Esther smiled down at her. What do you think? Will you stay a while? Well, I'm certainly not having much success with what I was doing before, Miriam replied. I might as well stay here where there's plenty of baked chicken to be had. That's the spirit. Now, would you please get up? Seeing you down there is making my arthritis act up. I'm not as gone as Viola, but I do have my achy moments. Miriam laughed. All right, I'll get up and I'll stay. Any other promises you'd like to extract from me while we're at it? Yes. Esther cupped Miriam's cheek in the palm of her hand. Promise me that you'll always be my sweet, sweet girl. I promise, Grandma. I'll always be yours. Maybe more stubborn than sweet, but yours. Chapter 8. Miriam was outside gathering fresh flowers for the center of the kitchen table when she heard a horse trotting up the road. She shielded her eyes and saw that it was Toby, dressed for church and carrying a small wrapped package. Hadn't she told him she didn't want to speak with him? Hadn't she been as plain as day? She gave an exasperated growl and marched into the house. "Grandma, lock all the doors and bar all the windows." "Whatever for?" Esther asked, looking up from the stove. "Toby Johnson is riding up the road this very minute, and I think he intends to make a call." Esther set down her spoon. "Would that be so terrible?" "Yes. I told him yesterday that I didn't want to speak with him. He's going against my specific instructions by showing up here." "Well, you never know. He might be coming to see me." Esther turned back to the skillet, a smile on her face. "Grandma, that's not funny." Miriam folded her arms. "Don't answer the door when he knocks." Esther turned around again. "First of all, young lady, this is my house, and I'll open the door whenever I please. I might even start opening it at random times during the day and night, simply because it's my door and I have the right to do so. Secondly, I think you should hear him out. Do you remember that stubborn streak of yours we were talking about last night? Well, if you don't learn to get it under control, you're going to find yourself regretting quite a lot of things, and I believe that losing Toby's friendship would be one of them." Miriam opened and closed her mouth a few times, trying to come up with a response. Her grandmother wasn't usually so pointed. I'll let him in, but I can't promise anything after that," she finally said. "I'll take it as a start. He's here now, so you might practice looking a little more pleasant." Miriam tried to smooth out her scowl as she walked toward the front door. She didn't see any reason to greet him with a smile, but she supposed she could at least try not to look like an ogre. When he tapped, she opened the door and gave him a nod, deciding that civility was her best course of action. "Good morning, Toby. How are you today?" "I'm quite well, Miriam. How is your sorghum crop coming along this year?" She blinked. My what?" "Your sorghum crop. If we're exchanging pleasantries, we might as well be thorough." "But we don't grow sorghum." "Then I'll retract my inquiry." Toby reached out and handed her the box. "A small gift to celebrate your arrival." Take it. It's not expensive, and it won't obligate you to anything." She sighed, remembering how easily he'd always been able to figure out what she was thinking. When she opened the box, a blue ribbon fell out, and dangling from it was a tiny cameo. She gasped, and her hands began to tremble. "Toby, where on earth did you find this?" "On the floor at school one day. I knew you dropped it, and I should have given it back, but I wanted something of yours, so I put it in my pocket." "And you've had it ever since?" "It's been in my pocket ever since," he clarified. Her gaze flew up to meet his. "You've carried it with you?" "No matter where I've gone." His expression became pleading. "May I speak with you?" She didn't want to let him in, but how could she refuse him when he'd just returned the dearest thing she owned, the thing she thought was gone forever? She stepped back wordlessly and led the way to the parlor, the cameo clutched tightly in her hand. "Tell me about the necklace." She sat on the edge of the sofa and looked down at her fist. "It was my mother's," she said softly. "It was the only thing I had left of hers. I never took it off until that day. I guess the ribbon came loose. I cried for weeks when I realized I'd lost it. I'm sorry, Miriam. If I'd known, I would have given it right back. I should have said something. I'm just so happy to see it now." She traced the tiny face of the cameo with the tip of her finger. She would get a proper chain and stop taking risks with it. "You said you wanted something of mine." "Yes." Toby shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. "That's actually quite romantic for let's see, you would have been 13?
for a 13-year-old boy. What can I say? You brought out the romantic in me. She could tell that he was trying to be light, but his words still cut her to the heart. Please don't, Toby. Don't joke with me about something so serious. Then tell me what you do want, Miriam. Tell me what I did. Tell me how to make this right. Tell me what happened so long ago that turned you against me. Something deep inside of her slammed shut as resolutely as an iron door, and she shook her head. I don't want to have this conversation. I don't see what good it could possibly do, and it would just dredge up things that are best left buried. And that's where you and I differ. I think it would do a great deal of good, and we'd both feel better afterwards. Like pulling a splinter? Precisely. She shook her head again. No, please just go, Toby. Thank you for returning the necklace, though. It means a lot to me to have it back. Even though I'm the reason it was missing this whole time? Well, yes, but I'm choosing not to dwell on that. He pressed his lips together. And yet you're hanging on to that other trespass of mine, whatever it was, without giving me the same courtesy? A headache was beginning to form behind her eyes. I never said it made sense. It's just how I feel. He walked over to the doorway of the parlor, then turned. I'm not giving up, Miriam. I don't believe that a person should be punished for a crime they didn't know they committed. And until we get to the root of this, I won't be satisfied. Then he left, and she listened as the horse hoofs trotted back up the road. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to pull her thoughts together. Was she being unfair to him? Absolutely. He was right when he said he deserved to know what he'd done. But his biggest offense had been wounding her pride, and it was her pride keeping her from telling him that. She didn't want to admit how very much she'd counted on him, how he'd given her strength she didn't have for herself, and how she'd crumbled when he was no longer there to provide it. She wasn't strong enough to admit she was weak. She walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, staring at the plate in front of her, not really seeing it. Esther brought the skillet of eggs over and set it on the trivet, then sat down across from Miriam. Try as I might, I couldn't eavesdrop from the stove, so you'll just have to tell me what that was all about, she said. Toby brought back my mother's cameo. I thought I'd lost it, but it turns out I dropped it at school one day, and he's had it in his pocket ever since. He has, like John keeping Meg's glove in Little Women. Esther beamed. That's so romantic. You'd think that, but no, not really. If he'd just given it back to me when I thought I lost it, I wouldn't have spent years kicking myself for my carelessness. And kicking yourself for a great many other things, too, Esther said gently. Have some breakfast and get ready for church, sweetheart. Focus on the good things of the day, and see if you can't let go of some of these feelings. It must hurt carrying around so much inside. It did hurt. It hurt quite a lot, but letting go? The thought made Miriam's stomach ache, and she didn't know why. Rather than trying to explain, she smiled. Thank you, Grandma. Breakfast looks delicious. You're welcome. And we have some refreshments left over from the party that we can eat for lunch. I enjoyed Jane's rolls quite a bit. Weren't those nice? Miriam agreed that yes, Jane's rolls were very nice as she took a bite of diced potatoes. Her headache had reduced to a dull buzz, but it was still definitely there, and she was afraid that no amount of party food would get rid of it for her. Church was awkward at best. Miriam could see Toby out of the corner of her eye, unless she held absolutely still, and that wasn't very comfortable. It was nice to say hello to her friends, and to be greeted by some who had been unable to make it to the party. And she enjoyed saying hello to Pastor Osborne and his wife Olivia, but the quicker she could leave, the happier she'd be.
Esther wanted to stay for a moment and visit with some of her friends, so Miriam said she'd walk home, making sure Esther would find a ride or someone to walk with too. Then she set out, so glad to be out of the confining church building and in the fresh air. "Miriam, wait!" She turned to see Kitty dashing after her and smiled. Kitty never did care about social rules. She'd run down the street on a Sunday if she had a good mind to. "Let me walk with you," she said, coming up alongside Miriam. She was only a little out of breath despite her exertion. "Grandma wanted to visit with her friends, and I knew if I waited I'd be there until dark," Miriam said. "My excuse for leaving my family behind is sheer nosiness. What's going on between you and Toby?" "Going on?" "Yes. He was watching you like a puppy stares at its empty dinner plate. It was all I could do to pay attention to the sermon. The story happening in the congregation was much more interesting." Miriam sighed. It felt like all she'd done since she'd arrived home was have long conversations about everything that was wrong with her. Self-reflection was a healthy thing, but so much of it in a matter of days just might be counterproductive. "Do you think I'm being stubborn?" "Of course," Kitty replied without hesitation. "But we're friends, and I will be here for you regardless." "And apparently you always tell me the truth," Miriam said wryly. Kitty tucked her arm through Miriam's. "We all need that one person in our lives who makes us see reason, don't we? I'm happy to be of service." "Thanks, Kit." Miriam took another deep breath of fresh air. "Do you mind if we just walk for a little while without talking? I've done so much talking over the last few days. I feel like any more would send me right over the edge." Kit didn't reply but gave her arm a squeeze, and they continued on their way. It was just what Miriam needed, the chance to clear her head, a good friend to share the moment with, and quiet. Blessed quiet. Chapter 9. Jane sat with Esther and Nola on the last bench of the chapel, hoping the Lord wouldn't mind that they were using his meeting house for a meeting of their own. "I'm honestly at my wits' end," Esther said, accepting the handkerchief Jane handed her. "My poor girl is carrying such a heavy burden, but she's struggling to put it down, and I don't know how to help her." "It sounds like you've had some wonderful talks, though," Jane commented. She'd never seen Esther so upset, and she wondered if getting involved in Miriam's life had been a good idea. Perhaps they should have let things run their natural course. "We really have, and I'm grateful for them. She's shared more about her feelings than I've ever known before, and I believe she's starting to understand how very much she's loved and wanted here. But as far as Toby goes, she still won't speak of him? No, she keeps sending him away. And it's a shame, too, because he has the most wonderful news," Nola chimed in. "He's just been given a job reporting for the newspaper. It's the sort of thing he's always wanted to do, and he's so pleased about it." "I'm sure she'll be glad for him," Esther replied. "But when he came by this morning, she asked him to leave so quickly, I don't think she gave him the chance to mention it." Jane's mind was whirling, trying to come up with a way to bring the two together and make them stay put for more than a few minutes at a time. "Esther, why don't you invite Toby over for Sunday dinner?" she said at last. "Miriam couldn't ask him to leave in the middle of a meal. She's been raised to have good manners, and that would give him an opportunity at least." "That's a wonderful idea," Nola said. "He's already left for home, but I could deliver the invitation myself." Esther nodded. "Let's do it. It's a bit sneaky, but if she won't cooperate through regular means, what choice do we have?" "None." "The sneakiness was forced upon us." Nola inclined her head. "What time should he be there?" 12:30, Esther replied. "That's perfect. One way or the other we'll get your girl mended, and we'll get my boy out from under my roof and bringing mayhem into my life." Nola paused. "He'll still come visit me, though, won't he? I'm going to miss him when he's gone." Jane smiled. Of course he'll come to see you. You're not losing him, you know." "I know. And I'm more happy than sad, believe you me. I'm just feeling nostalgic." Jane gave her friend a quick hug. "Everything's going to work out for the best, you'll see." And if it didn't, well, Jane wouldn't think that far ahead. She had to remain positive that their interference hadn't made things worse. "Miriam, come downstairs and set the table, please." Miriam passed a hand over her eyes. She must have dozed off when she lay down to rest her head. "Coming," she mumbled, as she pushed up to a sitting position. She was glad for her impromptu nap. She felt a little groggy, but the pain seemed to be gone. She smoothed her pillow-rumpled hair, then went downstairs. Her grandmother had already set a few stacks of plates on the table, and she noticed 3 dinner plates instead of the usual 2. "Grandma, are we having company?" "Yes, dear, I've invited Toby to join us." You have? But why?" "Because it's my dinner table, dear, and I can invite anyone I like." Esther's voice was bland, but Miriam picked up on the undertone. Yes, it was her grandmother's right to include anyone she liked, and Miriam would set the table without complaint. She had to wonder at her grandmother's new feisty attitude. Perhaps spending time with the ladies of her sewing circle was bringing it out in her. Almost as soon as the table was set, Miriam heard a knock on the door, and she moved to answer it before Esther could say anything. "Toby Johnson, twice in one day," she said as she let him in. "It must be a special occasion." "It's always a special occasion when I get to eat your grandmother's good cooking." Toby placed his hat on the small table in the hallway. "I understand it's just leftovers from the party yesterday." "Even better. I'm quite fond of leftovers." She led him into the kitchen, then put herself to work slicing some fresh cheese, keeping her face turned away so Toby wouldn't be able to discern her warring emotions. When she'd opened the door and had seen him, her heart leaped, and she didn't think it had the right to do any such thing. It was a traitor, telling her one thing and then doing something else. How could she trust herself to know what she wanted when her own heart didn't know? She set the cheese on the table, and they all sat. "Toby, thank you so much for coming today," Esther said. "It's been far too long since I've had you at my table." "I'm delighted to be here," he replied. "This is the nicest invitation I've had in a long time." The small talk continued as the serving platters rotated. Miriam was glad to see there was plenty of cake left. She'd likely need extra to survive this unique brand of torture. Once everyone was served, Esther said, "Nola was telling me that you've had some good news this week." "Yes, I have. Isaiah Burns down at the newspaper office liked the article I wrote about the party, and he's hired me on as a full-time reporter." "Oh, that's wonderful news. Miriam, isn't that wonderful news?" "Yes, it's wonderful," Miriam said, giving Toby a small smile. "It gives me the opportunity to make a difference, to feel like I'm helping our community," Toby went on. "And it also gives me some dependable work. I'm grateful for the odd jobs I've had, but nothing beats having a place to be on a regular basis." "I'm sure that's true," Esther replied. She glanced back and forth between the two of them. "Does anyone need jam?" "I don't think I put any on the table." "I'll get it." Miriam stood up so fast she almost knocked her chair over. Her grandmother kept the jam in a cupboard across the room, and this small errand gave her another chance to take a deep breath. She might as well just accept the fact that no matter how much she fought against it, she was going to keep running into Toby, and if it didn't happen naturally, her grandmother would invite him over. He would always be there, like an itch on her heel that she couldn't reach through her shoe, and she'd better start making peace with the idea. Either that or leave again. And she'd promised her grandmother she'd stay. She grabbed a jar of jam from the shelf and returned to the table, then forced another smile. "When do you start your job, Toby?" "Tomorrow morning. Mr. Burns said I'd be in training for a little while, so I'm sure I won't be handling any of the larger stories just yet. But I'm glad for whatever assignments I'm given." I'm sure you'll do a good job. There, she'd fulfilled her duty as a hostess, and she could now go back to eating her cake. Her grandmother would take over from there. Once the meal was over, Esther shooed them both out of the kitchen, insisting that she'd clean up without their help. Toby didn't seem inclined to leave, and Miriam wasn't sure what to do with him. She'd already thrown him out of the house once that day. Twice seemed like a bit much. "Shall we sit on the porch?" he suggested. That suited her just fine. It was halfway between him being there and going home, a step in the right direction. They each took one of the chairs on the front porch and began to rock, the steady rhythm soothing a few of Miriam's unraveling nerves. "I like it best out here after dark," she said. "The stars are particularly bright over that copse of trees." "It must be beautiful," Toby replied. "Yes, it is." See, she could make small talk, too. She congratulated herself. They rocked back and forth another minute, the silence looming, until finally Toby said, "How much is it costing you to hold yourself back from me?" She blinked. "Costing me? I don't understand." "I think you do. I think you're fighting something that doesn't need to be fought, paying dues that don't need to be paid." He reached over, took her hand, and held it. "Tell me you don't feel that." She did feel it. She felt tingles racing up and down her arm. She felt his nearness, his breath, his pulse. And she wanted to pull away because it was all too much too real. She didn't, though, because she didn't want him to see that she was scared. "What are you hoping to prove, Toby? Why are you trying so hard? Can you see this is going nowhere?" He shook his head. "That's not what I see at all. I see a woman almost ready to open her heart and share what's inside, and I see a man eagerly waiting for that moment, because that's all he's wanted for 5 long years. It's time, Miriam. Talk to me. Tell me what's going on." She looked down at their joined hands. The tingles had mellowed into a nice warm feeling, a comfortable sensation, and now she pulled away, needing to be able to think. If she did open up, if she did allow herself to become vulnerable again to him, what would happen? He could mock her feelings. He could laugh at her. He could tell her their entire relationship had been a lie, that he'd only meant to have a little fun, and it was never meant to be serious. That would hurt. But would it hurt as badly as the burden she'd been carrying this whole time? Could she be brave enough to let go? She stood up and faced the lawn, her thoughts and emotions scrambling over each other as they fought to come out. "Do you have any idea how long I've loved you?" she finally managed to say. "Probably as long as I've loved you. That's why I don't understand any of this. Why aren't we together? Why aren't we married and having babies right now? Because I overheard you talking to Charlie Patterson and Ralph Haynes the night of graduation. We were all at Mary's greenhouse, and I was in the hallway. I heard you telling them that you had no plans after college, that you considered yourself as free as a bird. Those aren't the words of a man who intends to get married and have those babies you're talking about." "You overheard that? I didn't even see you there." "I turned and ran. I ran all the way home, and the next morning I left for my uncle's in Denver. I couldn't stand knowing how little our plans had meant to you. I had to get away." Toby came to his feet. "You thought I didn't want to marry you?" "Miriam, Charlie was asking me about my career opportunities, not my marriage plans. I was telling him that I didn't have any offers of employment." "You were talking about work?" She leaned against the porch railing, suddenly numb. "Yes." He took a step toward her. "I wish you'd spoken to me. I wish you'd told me what you heard. I could have explained everything. Instead, the next thing I knew you were gone, and your grandmother wouldn't give me your address. She said you'd asked her not to. I didn't think I wanted to hear from you." Miriam swallowed a few times, trying to rid herself of the lump that was forming in her throat. "And I didn't want to talk about it. It would hurt too much." He looked at her, lifting an eyebrow. This is just like chocolate cake, isn't it?" "What on earth are you talking about?" He pressed his lips together in frustration. "My grandmother got mad at me for eating the chocolate cake, but she never told me it was for something special. She expected me just to know. Now, if I had known it was for you, I never would have touched it, but I had no idea. I'm not a mind reader, Miriam. How am I supposed to know things if I'm not told? And how was I supposed to know why you left? I figured that since you didn't want me, it wouldn't matter if I left. That's just plain ridiculousness. I'm sorry, Miriam, but it is." He ran a hand through his hair. "Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I want and don't want? And shouldn't I be the one to say if I want to call off our engagement? You can't decide my feelings for me. You can only decide your own." The knot in her throat had turned to a ball of lead in her stomach. How wrong had she been all these years? She'd jumped to conclusions, believed things that weren't true, and punished both of them because of it. Was she really so unable to accept rejection that she'd destroy what she had before it could destroy her? Listen to me, Miriam Brown. I dare say it's time we put all this in the past, don't you? That was 5 years ago. 5 years we've wasted because of conversations we refuse to have. None of that matters now. The only thing that matters is that we've been given a second chance, and if we don't take it, we'll be making an even bigger mistake than we did in the first place." Miriam turned away again. Anger hurt less than the aching pain she'd been carrying for so long, and if she got rid of the anger, the ache would be too much to bear. "Don't hide from me any more, Miriam," he said gently. "Tell me what you're thinking." She wiped her cheeks. "I'm thinking that I've cried entirely too much over the last 2 days, and I wish I'd stop." He chuckled. "And what else?" "That it hurts to love, that it hurts to be open and honest." He stepped up behind her and rested his hands on her forearms. "But doesn't it also feel enlivening and liberating? I'm not sure that I've ever let myself feel like that." It was painful to say the words aloud, but she knew she must. She had to face them, and she had to stop living in such an isolated way. Shutting herself off from pain was also shutting herself off from joy, and she wanted joy so desperately. Toby slowly turned her around, his hands still on her arms, and then brought her in close. She didn't realize he was going to kiss her until he was doing it, and her first instinct was to push him away. Her very next instinct, though, was to wrap her arms around his waist. This was what she really wanted. To hold him, to be held, to belong, to be his. The kiss was over far too soon. He stepped back and looked into her eyes. "If you really want to stay angry at me, I can't make you change your mind," he said. "But I think we have too much to lose and so much to gain. I can't imagine myself with anyone but you, Miriam. You've been everything to me since we were children. That's not going to change. I don't want to be angry anymore." Her voice was so low it was almost a whisper. "But I don't know what to replace it with." "Love," he replied. "Replace it with love. Will you show me how?" "Absolutely." He took both her hands in his. "Let's start by trusting each other enough to talk to each other, all right? About everything. But especially the things that are bothering us." She smiled, feeling a bit tremulous. "I should have asked you outright. I was just so scared to hear your answer." "You would rather believe I rejected you than to ask if I'd rejected you?" She flinched. "It sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it?" He rubbed the backs of her knuckles with his thumb. "It sounds like the normal reaction of a person who's been hurt and doesn't want to be hurt anymore." He paused. "Your parents, if I'm not mistaken." She nodded. "I loved them, and they left. Not by choice. No one would ever choose to leave you. I only stayed away because it's what you wanted. So why are you here now? I told you before that I didn't want to see you." He pursed his lips. "Well, you could say that I decided I'm just as stubborn as you are, and that maybe it was time I got my way for once." "What? I don't always get my way." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is that so?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "All right, maybe I do. A lot of the time. And maybe it really is your turn." Toby grinned. "That's a very nice admission to hear." He took a step closer. "I love you, Miriam Brown, and that's a solid fact. I'm willing to take this as slowly as you need to. We have a lot of catching up to do. And I'm telling you now, I intend to marry you someday." He still wanted to marry her after everything that had happened. That seemed almost impossible to believe. And yet he'd said the words. She hadn't imagined it. "I'm not sure I'm the marrying type, Toby. Shouldn't you be choosing someone more settled, less confused and ornery?" "I don't want someone less confused and ornery. I want you." She smirked. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "And I'm not sure you're accepting compliments right now." He squeezed her hands. "As slowly as you need to go. Just don't close the door on me. Not again." "You're still willing to take a chance on me, even knowing I have so many things to learn about myself?" "Even knowing all that. And believe me, I'm going through the same thing. Maybe you're not the only confused and ornery person on this porch." And here I thought I was special." "Oh, so first you're not accepting compliments, and now you're fishing for them?" He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not quite sure what you're up to, Miss Brown." "I don't think I know either." She let go of his hands, but only to sit down again. She was feeling worn out after everything they discussed. She wasn't used to having so many emotions flooding through her at once. She wasn't used to feeling that many emotions at all. She'd learned to block them out and acknowledge them one at a time. "My grandmother and I spent some time talking last night about my parents and my sense of loss. I think I'm beginning to make sense of it all, but it's still so raw." "I'm glad you're sharing that with her. She's the best one to help you sort through your feelings, because she knew your parents well. Besides you, of course." "Yes, I can see that now. I just wish I'd understood it years ago." Miriam sighed. "Do you think we'll ever reach a point where we automatically respond or behave the way we should right from the start? Or will we always be blundering around in the dark, saying and doing the wrong things, hurting people along the way, and stubbing our own toes while we're at it?" "I don't know," Toby replied. "I sure hope so. If not, I think we're all doomed. Life's about experimentation and learning from those experiments, as my grandma always says. As I get older, I understand a little better what she means." "So," Miriam hated to bring it up and spoil the moment, but she had to know. "What are we now, Toby? We know we have feelings for each other, but I don't think we're ready to court, and I can't think of a way to describe this awkward truce." He laughed. "Do all awkward truces involve kissing? Because I believe I kissed you a moment ago, unless I imagined it." "No, you kissed me." Her cheeks grew a little warm as she recalled how much she'd enjoyed that kiss. "But what does it mean?" "What if it means that for now we're friends and we'll decide the rest later? You're right, we're not ready to court. And I think it would be foolish to pin ourselves to one definition. In my heart, you've always been my girl. And I'm content to keep thinking of you that way until it's time to make it more official. I have no doubt that day is coming. We just don't know when." Miriam nodded. It was coming. She knew it too. She also knew that she had a great deal of self-introspection to carry out, and she needed to keep examining her feelings about Toby, and making sure that she really had brought out her reasons for being angry at him. If she was holding anything back, it wouldn't bode well for their future. She needed to be upfront with him about everything. She'd learned that from her grandmother the night before, and she hoped that Toby was ready to make the same sort of commitment. "I want to show you something," he said. "Can you take a buggy ride with me this evening?" "Oh, now you're coming to see me 3 times in one day? I'm all astonishment." He grinned. "Just keeping you on your toes. Will you come?" "Yes, I'll come." She had no idea what he wanted to show her, but he was obviously excited about it. He stood. "All right, then. I'll go for now and arrange for a buggy, but I'll be back around 7. "I'll be ready." She watched him leave, his shoulders straight, a slight bounce to his step. She felt lighter, too, even though she was exhausted. She'd released the larger part of her burden, and it had taken a toll on her. She finally realized what Toby meant when he asked about the cost she was paying. She'd actually given up her peace of mind because she was so determined to stay angry. But not anymore. She'd learned how to let it go. She'd learned how to find that peace again. Chapter 10. Toby couldn't stop grinning as he guided the borrowed horse and buggy along the streets of Topeka toward his destination. On his way to pick up Miriam, he'd worried for a moment that he'd imagined their reconciliation, that he'd turn up and she'd send him away with as much disdain as she had after the party. But no, she was waiting for him on the front porch, her cameo necklace in the hollow of her throat, and she looked eager to go. "Where are you taking me?" she asked as the buggy rattled along down the rutted path. "I can't tell you yet, but it's someplace very special to me," he replied. He hoped she liked it. He'd envisioned her there so many times, it was impossible to separate them in his mind. "That sounds mysterious." It's not mysterious, but it is a surprise." He guided the buggy around a curve, then turned the corner onto another road. As the buggy emerged from the cover of the trees that lined their way, the property he'd chosen stretched before them, and he glanced over for her reaction. Her eyes were wide, and she seemed unable to find words. "Do you like it?" he asked. "I found this spot one day while I was out riding, and I decided it had to be mine someday. I've been saving up ever since, and I plan to put a cabin there and a barn there." He continued to describe his plans for the place, but he sensed that she wasn't really listening. As soon as he brought the buggy to a stop, she leaped down and ran several dozen yards, her arms wide. "Miriam?" He climbed down and followed her. "Do you like it?" She turned to him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How did you know? Did someone tell you?" "Did someone tell me what?" "You have to know. Things like this don't happen by coincidence." He shook his head. "I honestly don't." She twirled around, her arms stretched out like wings. "This is where my house used to be, where I was born. The house that burned down." "Really?" Toby couldn't believe it. Of all the places he could have chosen, of all the places he could have fallen in love with. "Are you sure?" "Yes, look." She pointed down to the ground. "One of the chimney stones is still here. The rest must have been carried off, but this one looks buried too deeply to steal. How would I know the chimney was right there if I've never been here before?" "You couldn't know." Toby shook his head. "I couldn't have known either. We never talked about it, and no one ever told me this was the spot." "You're planning to build here? This isn't just a dream?" "No dream. Once I've worked for the newspaper for a couple of months, I'll have enough to make it a reality. The house on this spot," he paused, "our house, if that's what you want." Tears filled her eyes. "I do want it, Toby. I want it so very much." He grinned. "Well then, Miss Brown, I hereby announce my intention of courting you. Still taking things nice and slow, of course, since I have a house to build." He met her eyes with his gaze.
Are you sure that living here won't bring back too many sad memories? I only have one night's worth of bad memories here, but 6 whole years of good ones. I was happy here, blissfully happy, and I know I will be again." She reached out and took his hand. "How is this possible? How can one man be the answer to everything I need? Your patience, your understanding, and now bringing me here. There are no coincidences, Toby. This was meant to be. And don't forget my hard-headedness." "No one could forget your hard-headedness. Or mine." She looked up in his eyes. Thank you for all of it." He slid his arms around her waist and pulled her close. She rested her cheek against his lapel, and they stood that way for several minutes, looking out over the patch of land they would call their own. They would rebuild their relationship as they rebuilt the house, and together they would build a family, one brick at a time.